Cicada. Cicada, a novel of silicon and spies. A machine is only a way of remembering an idea. Steal the machine, and you have a souvenir. Steal the idea, and you have changed the weather over half the world. Attributed to the engineer Otho Caldwell, 1919. The cicadas had not yet come to Georgia that spring, but 8,000 miles away, in a room without windows, a man was already listening for them. The room was on the 11th floor of a building that pretended, on its brass plate, to be the Institute for Advanced Materials Cooperation. It pretended a great many things. The carpet was the gray of a dead television, the lighting was the color of a headache, and the air had the chilled, recycled flatness of a place where no window had ever been opened, because no window had ever been built. In the center of the room, a single screen glowed, and in front of the screen sat Han Ziyu, very still, the way a heron is still over water. He was reading a scientific abstract. It was 4 sentences long, posted to a public conference server by a small American college that almost no one in the world had heard of, and it had cost the People's Republic of China precisely nothing to obtain. That was the joke of the modern trade, Han thought. The Americans built their treasures behind oceans and lawyers and walls of money, and then they stood on the wall and shouted the secret across the water in the hope that another scholar might admire it. Look what we have made. Look how clever we are. Vanity was the oldest open door in the world, and it never needed a key. He read the 4 sentences a third time. He had read tens of thousands of such abstracts in his career, and he had learned to read them the way a doctor reads a chart, not for the words, which lied, but for the small numbers, which could not. The numbers in this one were impossible. A computing device, not a quantum machine. He distrusted the noise around quantum machines the way he distrusted the noise around anything that men in suits had learned to pronounce at dinner parties. No, this was something stranger and far more dangerous because it was buildable. The abstract spoke of an architecture that performed the arithmetic of artificial intelligence not with the patient, sweating, electron-clogged silicon of the graphics processors that the whole world fought over, that whole nations now hoarded like grain before a famine, but with light. With photons threaded through a lattice of phase-change glass, doing in a single shimmer what a warehouse of the Americans' best chips did in an hour, and doing it on the power of a reading lamp. If the numbers were real, the device in the abstract could train the mind of a machine 1,000 times faster than anything now on Earth, on a fraction of the power, and cool itself with a sigh. Which meant, and this was the thought that had brought Han forward to the edge of his chair, that the entire crushing, continent-spanning apparatus of machine intelligence, the compute that trained the models that flew the drones and broke the ciphers and modeled the weapons, could be folded down small enough to carry out of a building in a man's 2 hands. If the numbers were real, whoever owned it would own the next 40 years. Han set down the cooling cup of tea at his elbow without drinking from it, and, without being aware he was doing it, began to hum. It was an old song, a marching song from a war his grandfather had fought and his father had survived, and that Han himself knew only as a melody, the words long since worn off it like the date from an old coin. He hummed it under his breath whenever he was calculating, and he was calculating now. His right hand, resting on the desk, gave the smallest tremor, a fine, continuous vibration like a struck wire, and he covered it with his left hand without thinking, the gesture as automatic as breathing. The tremor was 11 years old. It had been a gift from a furnace in a laboratory in Hefei in the days when Han Ziyu had been a physicist and not yet a fisherman of other men's physics, and on certain nights, in certain weather, the burned skin along the inside of his wrist still remembered the heat. The door opened without a knock. Only one person in the building opened that door without knocking, and Han was on his feet before the man had crossed the threshold.
"You've seen it,"
said the visitor. He did not give his name. In that building, names were a kind of nakedness. He was a heavy man in an expensive, badly tailored jacket, with the soft hands and hard eyes of someone who had spent 30 years signing other people's death warrants in triplicate. The section called him privately the deputy. He came to the door of the listening room perhaps twice a year, and never with good news, because good news could be sent by courier.
"I've read 4 sentences. 4 sentences are not a thing. They are a smell of a thing."
The standing committee read the same 4 sentences this morning, and they did not like the smell. You understand the situation. For 3 years, the Americans have been strangling us. Chips, lithography machines, the very sand. We buy time. We buy back doors. We buy graduate students. We build our own, and we are good. We are very good. We are 18 months behind and closing. And now a college I have never heard of, in a state I cannot find on a map, proposes to make the entire quarrel obsolete. To make every chip on Earth, theirs and ours alike, into a paperweight. Do you understand what that is?
It is a door.
It is the door, and it is standing open in a field in the American South, guarded by professors who put the keys on the internet. I am authorizing a full effort. Recruitment, technical, and if it comes to it, removal. You will lead it. Quietly, ZU. We do not want another Houston. We do not want flags burning on television. We want the thing, the design, the recipe, the man who knows where the bodies of the equations are buried. And we want the Americans to wake up one morning and find that what they invented in Georgia is already humming in Guiyang, and to never quite be able to prove how.
Han looked at the screen. Somewhere in the document's metadata was the name of a town. He had already memorized it, the way one memorizes the name of a woman one intends to marry, or to ruin. Chattahoochee Hills. It sounded, he thought, like the noise a fountain makes.
There is a difficulty. Things this new are made by very few people. A handful. Sometimes only 1 or 2 minds truly hold the shape of it. You cannot photocopy a shape that lives behind a man's eyes. You have to acquire the man, or persuade him, or break him, or carry the whole of him across the ocean in a box. It is delicate.
That is precisely why I am sending the most delicate man I have. Take Shen, and take the quiet one. I do not expect you to need the quiet one, but take him.
The door closed. The cold air settled. Han Ziyu stood alone in the listening room, the impossible 4 sentences glowing in front of him. And after a moment, he sat back down, covered his trembling right hand with his steady left, and resumed, very softly, his grandfather's song. 8,000 miles to the east, the sun was setting over the red clay of Georgia. And in a small town no one had heard of, the cicadas were beginning, 3 weeks early, to stir in the warm ground. Chapter 1. A Pretty Town to Die In. It is a particular kind of country, the southwestern corner of Fulton County, and it does not look like the rest of America's idea of itself. 40 minutes from the runways of Atlanta, from the busiest airport on the planet, where 250,000 strangers a day touch the earth and rise off it again, the 8-lane world simply runs out. The billboards thin and then stop. The chain restaurants surrender. The road narrows to 2 lanes and begins, almost shyly, to wander, as though it had remembered something. And on either side of it, the land lifts into low green hills that the last ice age forgot to flatten. There are horse farms behind white fences. There are pastures gone gold in the long light. There are stands of loblolly pines so straight and tall they seem less like trees than like the columns of some enormous roofless church. And in the bottoms, along the creeks that all eventually find their crooked way to the Chattahoochee River, the hardwoods crowd down to the water, and the kudzu climbs over everything that stops moving. Over fences, over dead oaks, over an abandoned tractor, draping the wreckage of the past in a smooth, patient, lurid green, so that the whole landscape looks as if it is being slowly, gently, beautifully digested. In the heat of late May, the air smelled of cut grass and warm tar, and underneath it, the river, a green, mineral, ancient smell. And over all of it, that spring, 3 weeks ahead of any calendar, lay the sound, the high, sawing, electric drone of the cicadas, rising and falling in the trees like surf, like a vast machine left running in an empty house. Wyatt Cole sat on the tailgate of his truck at the top of Caldwell Ridge and listened to it. He was 31 years old, and he had the kind of stillness that other men who had never needed it, sometimes mistook for slowness. He was not slow. He sat the way he had been taught to sit at observation posts in places whose names were classified and whose heat had been a different, drier, more murderous heat than this one. Economically, his weight settled, his hands quiet on his knees, his eyes moving across the country below him in a slow, professional sweep that he was no longer aware of performing. Lean through the shoulders, sun-darkened along the forearms, with a face that had been handsome once in an uncomplicated way, and was better now for the few lines that had been put into it. There was a scar, thin and white, along the line of his jaw, where a fragment of a Hilux's windshield had once tried to introduce itself to his carotid artery, and missed by the width of a prayer. He did not think about the Hilux anymore. That was the entire point of Georgia. These days he was Caldwell College's Director of Security, a title that had meant parking decals and drunk freshmen and a propped fire door at the back of the dining hall, and almost nothing else, for 3 quiet years. Right up until 3 nights ago. Below him, on a shelf of cleared ground halfway down the ridge, sat Caldwell College. It was not a famous place. It would never be a famous place, and that was its charm and its tragedy both. It had been founded in 1921 by Otho Caldwell, a cotton gin heir and self-taught engineer who had made a second fortune in railroad signaling and a third in something to do with the early telephone, and who had decided, in the high noon of his wealth, that what the world needed was a small school where boys would learn Greek in the morning and lathe work in the afternoon, on the eccentric theory that a man who could read Homer and machine a crankshaft could not easily be made a fool of by anyone. A century had softened the Greek and the boys only, and a good deal of the eccentricity, but the bones of the place remained. A dozen brick buildings the color of dried blood, gone soft and rounded at their corners under a century of ivy and weather. A quadrangle of grass kept improbably green. A chapel with a clock that had been wrong since the Eisenhower administration. And downhill and apart from the rest, the one building Otho Caldwell would have actually loved. A long, low, ugly, beautiful hall of glass and corrugated steel that everyone called simply the shed. The shed was the engineering laboratory. It had 1,300 students' worth of college funneled into the dreams of perhaps 40 of them. And inside it, 3 nights ago at 2:14 in the morning, those 40 dreams had briefly, against every reasonable expectation, come true. Wyatt was still not sure he believed it. He heard the gravel before he saw the car, a tired, sun-bleached green that had once been British racing green, on a Land Rover Defender old enough to have opinions. And then Dr. Eleanor Vance was climbing out of it with a thermos in one hand and her reading glasses pushed up into her hair, where they lived more or less permanently, like a second, smaller pair of eyes.
You're brooding. You brood at this exact spot. I could set a watch by you, if I owned a watch. Which I don't, because watches are a conspiracy by the Swiss to make engineers feel poor.
I'm not brooding. I'm doing surveillance on the future. Coffee?
It's not coffee. It's the idea of coffee, 6 hours after the fact.
She climbed up onto the tailgate beside him with the careless economy of a woman who had stopped, around the age of 43, caring what anyone thought of how she climbed onto anything. Nell Vance was small and sharp and built like a closed fist, with iron gray hair she cut herself, badly, and a chin she carried slightly forward, as if into a wind that only she could feel. She had a doctorate from a university whose name made admissions officers go pale, and 11 years at a company in California whose name made everyone go pale. And she had left both of those places under circumstances she described, when she described them at all, as creative differences regarding the question of who, exactly, had had the idea. She had come to Caldwell College 6 years ago to teach undergraduates the physics of semiconductors, and she had stayed, everyone assumed, because it was cheap and quiet, and no one in Chattahoochee Hills had ever once asked her to circle back. She had stayed, Wyatt had come to understand, because at Caldwell no one could take the idea away from her. There was no one to take it.
Tell me again it's real.
It's real.
Tell me the number.
She turned and looked at him, and for just a second the armor of her sarcasm came off, and what was underneath it was so naked and so young that he had to look away, back down at the shed.
It is real, and the number is 912.
912. The little chip in the shed, the size of a saltine cracker, a lattice of glass and rare elements that Hannah had grown and tuned and cursed at over 4 years, and that they had named, half as a joke after the bugs screaming in the trees, had performed the one task the whole industry used to weigh its giants, a single training step, the elementary heartbeat of teaching a machine to think. And it had performed that step 912 times faster than the best graphics processor money could buy, at a fraction of the power, with the optical routing holding clean across the lattice, the kind of processor that the largest companies on Earth were currently buying in the hundreds of thousands, building windowless temples the size of small cities to house and cool, drinking down the output of whole power plants to feed. The number was not even the frightening part. The frightening part was that the chip itself was very nearly stupid, a passive little wafer of patterned glass that did precisely nothing on its own. The genius was not in the device. It was in the architecture wrapped around it, the calibration, the maddening 4-year trick of routing light through the lattice so that the arithmetic of thought simply happened, at the speed of light, for almost no power at all. The chip you could photograph, the chip you could put in your pocket and walk out the door with. But the magic lived in the method, and a great deal of the method still lived nowhere on Earth but behind Hannah Reese's eyes. 912 times faster on the power of a desk lamp by doing the arithmetic with light, which meant Wyatt had worked it through on the drive up, coldly, the way he worked everything through, that whatever a hyperscaler's windowless temple could do today, this could do in a closet, that the entire roaring, power-starved, continent-spanning machinery of artificial intelligence, the machinery that trained the models that flew the drones and broke the ciphers and modeled the weapons and rationed the power grids, had just been made small enough to carry out of a building in a backpack. The most concentrated advantage on the planet, in money and in war and in the price of electricity itself, made suddenly, catastrophically portable.
It changes everything.
Wyatt said. It was not a clever thing to say. It was just true, and the truth of it sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He had spent a former life around objects men would kill to own, in rooms in countries he no longer named aloud, and he knew, with the flat, unwelcome certainty of someone who had once been the thing they sent to do the killing, that he had never in his life stood within arm's reach of anything the world would kill for faster than the little glass wafer glowing in the shed below.
It changes everything.
She unscrewed the thermos, looked at what was inside it, and screwed it shut again.
Which is exactly what worries me. Because in my experience, Wyatt, the universe does not hand a small, broke, deeply unfashionable college on a hill in Georgia a thing that changes everything, and then simply let it keep it. The universe is not in the habit of leaving money on the table. Sooner or later...
She nodded down at the bright glass roof of the shed, glittering in the long gold light.
The rest of the world is going to come up that road. And when it does, I would very much like us to know what we are doing. Because right now, son, we are 3 engineers and a bug, and we have no idea.
Below them, the cicadas sawed on. The clock in the chapel tower, wrong by 60-some years, struck a confident and erroneous 5. As if it had been waiting for the hour, Wyatt's phone buzzed against his hip. He looked at it. It was the camera system. The dozen cheap cameras he had inherited with the job and never, in 3 years, had a single reason to think about. One had dropped offline. Shed, interior, clean room corridor. He thumbed it open. The last frame the camera had sent before it died sat frozen on the little screen, time-stamped 3 seconds after 5 o'clock. An empty hallway, the fire door shut at the far end. The cold room light burning steady. Then nothing. A flat gray tile of no signal where a corridor ought to be. Probably a loose connector. Probably a squirrel in the conduit. It had happened twice last winter. Probably nothing at all. But Wyatt Cole had spent 18 years learning the difference between the silence of a thing that is broken and the silence of a thing that has been switched off. And the two do not feel the same. And this one, he could not for the life of him have told you why, felt like the second kind. He said nothing to Nell. He put the phone away and looked back down the long gold reach of the ridge road, and neither of them said it, but both of them felt it now. That the road up the ridge had never seemed so long or so exposed. Chapter 2. The Coffee at Hazel's. There is no town center in Chattahoochee Hills, not really. The place is too new and too rural, and too deliberately spread out for that. But there is a crossroads a mile below the college, where 4 things have gathered the way 4 things will. A Baptist church, a feed and hardware store, a gas station that also inexplicably and excellently sells boiled peanuts and fried pies, and a coffee shop called Hazel's. Hazel's had been, in a previous life, a filling station, and it had kept the bones of one. The deep canopy out front where the pumps had been, the wide glass front, the concrete floor worn smooth and faintly oil-stained. Hazel herself was long dead, but her granddaughter, Tamar, ran the place now, and she had filled it with mismatched church sale furniture, a great hissing brass espresso machine she had bought used from a failed cafe in Atlanta, and the best biscuits in the southern half of the county. In the mornings, it filled with farmers and horse people and the kind of well-heeled Atlanta refugees who had bought the old places out toward Serenbe. And from about 10 o'clock, when the breakfast crowd thinned, it filled with students from the college up the hill, who came down for the Wi-Fi and the air conditioning and Tamar's biscuits and the privilege of saying, with the bottomless self-importance of the young, the most extraordinary things at the tops of their voices. On the morning of the 2nd of June, the most extraordinary things in the state of Georgia were being said at a corner table by Wyatt Cole and Hannah Reese, and they were being overheard. The man doing the overhearing was sitting 3 tables away with a cup of black coffee and a slice of fried peach pie he had no intention of finishing. And he had the comfortable, expensive, slightly rumpled look of a man who has stopped, late in life, being in a hurry. He was somewhere in his middle 60s. He wore a faded chambray shirt, soft as a worn dollar bill, canvas trousers, and on his left wrist, where another man his age and net worth might have worn something gold and shouting, a plain steel watch on a leather strap. A small, severe, beautiful thing made by a workshop in a Swiss valley that turned out perhaps 200 watches a year. The kind of watch that says nothing to anyone except the one other person in the room who knows exactly what it is and exactly what it costs to know. His name was Calloway Drummond, and 40 years and 3 companies ago, he had been a young engineer with a single good idea about how to make far-flung computers talk to one another, and the world had paid him, eventually and enormously, for that idea. And he had spent the long back half of his life learning the difficult art of having nothing in particular to do. He was, just now, 3 weeks into a road trip with no destination, in a 1972 Mercedes the color of clotted cream that he drove badly and loved unreasonably. And he had stopped in Chattahoochee Hills because a sign had said, "Boiled peanuts," and because the light on the hills had been, frankly, indecent. And he had wandered into Hazel's for a coffee and a sit, and he had been about to leave when the girl at the corner table said a number out loud.
Because it isn't incremental, that's what nobody downhill understands.
Hannah Reese was saying. She had a way of talking with her whole self, leaning across the table, her hands describing in the air the shapes of things that had no shapes. She was 29, with dark hair escaping a pencil she had stabbed through it that morning and forgotten, and brown forearms freckled from a childhood on the Gulf Coast, and a clever, mobile, unguarded face. And when she got going about her work, her eyes did a thing. They lit, literally lit, the way a window lights when someone turns on a lamp in a dark house, that Wyatt Cole had been trying and failing not to notice for the better part of a year. Everybody thinks faster chip, and they picture, what? A phone that opens apps quicker. They picture more of the same. They don't get that there's a wall. There's a physical wall. Heat, electrons, the size of an atom. You literally cannot push past it with silicon. The whole industry's been sprinting at a brick wall for a decade and calling it progress, because the wall keeps getting a little farther away each year. Except it doesn't. It's a mirage.
Inside voice.
Wyatt murmured, not looking up from his biscuit. And we didn't move the wall, Wyatt. That's the thing. We went around it. We stopped using electrons to do the math and we started using light. And the second you do that, the wall isn't there. There's just open country. She sat back, almost shaken by it. 912 times. On the training step, and that's the prototype. That's the ugly one held together with hope. Hannah's garbage first attempt. The real one,
Lower,
said Wyatt. I'm not saying the name. You said the number twice. The number's meaningless without the name, and the name's the only part that... She stopped and grinned, suddenly aware of herself, and lowered her voice at last to something almost human. Okay. But Wyatt, it works. We trained the little vision model on it last night in 4 minutes, the same run that takes the cluster up at the shed 9 hours, 4 minutes, and the chip was barely warm. I had my hand on the housing, and I sat there in the dark and I thought, I am the only person on Earth right now who knows the future just changed. Me and you and Nell and Daniel. 4 people in a steel shed in Georgia. How is that possible? And Calloway Drummond, 3 tables away, set down his fork very, very quietly, so as not to make a sound, and discovered that his heart was going like a much younger man's. He had spent 40 years in and around the technology business. He had heard 10,000 young people in 10,000 coffee shops describe the thing that was going to change the world. The technology business ran on that particular fuel, that particular heat. And 99 times in 100 it was the heat of burning money and nothing more. He had developed, of necessity, a very good ear. The ear, he sometimes thought, of an old prospector who can tell from across a saloon by the way a man sets down his glass whether the gold in his pocket is real or fool's. And what was making the old prospector's hands shake, here in this converted filling station that smelled of biscuits and coffee and warm asphalt, was a single detail that no liar would ever have thought to invent. She had said the chip was barely warm. Liars promised speed. Liars always promised speed. Speed was cheap to promise. No con man in the history of the technology business had ever paused in the middle of his pitch to mention with quiet wonder that he had been able to rest his hand on the housing. That was not the kind of thing you said when you were selling. That was the kind of thing you said when it was true, because the heat, or the absence of it, was the whole secret, the thing behind the thing, the part of it that an engineer noticed in the dark at 2 in the morning and could not stop thinking about. The world fought over those screaming, power-drunk chips not because they were slow, but because they were hot, because feeding and cooling them was strangling the planet's power grids, because the entire bottleneck of the artificial future was, when you boiled it down, a problem of heat. And this girl, with a pencil through her hair, had just casually mentioned that she'd made the heat go away. Calloway Drummond had been, for 3 weeks, a man with nothing in particular to do. He found, quite suddenly, that he had something to do. He picked up his coffee and his untouched pie, and he walked the 3 tables across the worn concrete floor, and he pulled out the spare chair at the corner table and sat down in it without being asked, which was not at all like him. And he looked at the wary ex-soldier and the luminous girl with the pencil in her hair, and he smiled the easy, disarming, slightly self-mocking smile that had once talked 3 venture firms out of $40 million in a single afternoon, and he said,
Forgive an old man for eavesdropping, but I believe you two just told me you've solved the heat. And if that's true, and I have spent a long and tedious life learning to tell when it's true, then I think I'd very much like to buy your next cup of coffee, and possibly, he added, your entire company, which I gather you have not yet got around to starting.
There was a silence at the corner table. Wyatt Cole had stopped eating. He had set the biscuit down, and his hands had gone to that particular quietness that Nell had once mistaken for slowness. And behind his unhurried, even gaze, he was running, very fast and very cold, an assessment that had nothing to do with the technology business. 65, maybe 70. Good shoes, soft hands, no threat in the hands. Watch is real. That's a year of a man's salary on his wrist, and he's wearing it like a Casio, which means old money or new money gone quiet. Came in alone. Parked alone, that ridiculous cream Mercedes out front, that's his. It fits him. Not a journalist. Journalists lean in. He leaned back. Not corporate. Corporate doesn't eat pie. He overheard us. He's right about what he overheard. And that, Wyatt thought, with the small, cold drop of the stomach that he had learned, in another life, to trust above any other instinct, is the first time the rest of the world came up the road. And it didn't even have to drive. It was already sitting 3 tables away, eating Tamar's peach pie.
And who,
Said Wyatt Cole, very pleasantly,
are you?
Chapter 3. The Man with the Cream-Colored Car. His name, it turned out, checked out. Wyatt made sure of that before he made sure of anything else. He excused himself to the men's room with his phone, and in 90 seconds, standing by the hand dryer, he confirmed what the watch had already told him. Calloway Drummond was real, and was exactly, tediously, verifiably who he said he was. There were profiles. There were old magazine covers, the man 20 years younger, the same self-mocking smile. There was a foundation with his name on it that gave away a great deal of money to a great many things, quietly, in the South. There was, in the way of these things, a great deal of public man and almost no private one. The trails simply stopped at the edge of the money, the way such trails do. What there was not, Wyatt noted, was any reason on earth for him to be in Chattahoochee Hills. And in Wyatt's experience, a man with no reason to be somewhere was either the most innocent person in the room or the most dangerous, and the two looked, from the outside, exactly alike. He came back to the table. Hannah was already 3 sentences deep, of course. She would have told a kindly stranger the entire secret architecture of the chip and her mother's maiden name inside of 10 minutes, because Hannah's heart had no firewall. It was one of the things that made her brilliant, and one of the things that was going to get them all killed. And Wyatt sat back down and put, gently, a hand flat on the table between them, which was their private signal, established over a year of demos and grant pitches that meant, slow down, love, you're giving it away. She caught it. She slowed.
Here's what I'd like to do,
Drummond was saying.
I'd like to see it, not the pitch. God spare me the pitch. I've heard every pitch ever pitched. I'd like to walk into your lab, and I'd like to watch the thing do the thing with my own eyes. And then I'd like to buy you all a dinner that doesn't come out of a fryer, and we can talk about whether an old man with more money than sense and nothing to do with his afternoons can be of any use to you. That's all. No papers, no lawyers, not yet. Just...
He spread his soft hands. A look. Nell Vance, when they brought him to the shed an hour later, was not gracious about it. Absolutely not, she said, before he'd finished the doorway. No, I don't know you. I don't know what you want. And the last time a charming man with good shoes walked into a lab I was working in and told me he just wanted a look, I spent the next 9 years watching him collect a great deal of credit for a thing I had thought of in the shower. So no, thank you. The door is the way you came in.
Dr. Vance,
said Drummond mildly.
The man you're describing was, I'd put money on it, a venture capitalist.
He was the king of them. Then we have something in common, you and I. Because I spent 30 years building things while men like that took the credit, and then I spent 10 years being one of them. And I assure you there is no one on earth who despises a venture capitalist quite so thoroughly as a reformed one. He looked around the shed, at the bare steel rafters where someone had hung a string of fairy lights and a Gadsden flag and a banner that said in marker, "Go Bugs." At the workbenches drifted with the beautiful debris of real work, oscilloscopes and probe stations and a coffee maker furred with calcified mineral. At the optical table in the clean corner, isolated on its air legs, where under a black cloth like a parrot's cage at night sat the thing itself. And something in his face, some hunger or some grief, made even Nell go quiet.
I'm not here to take it from you,
Drummond said.
I'm too old to want anything badly enough to steal it. I'm here because I've been driving around the country for 3 weeks trying to find one single thing left in this world that I give a damn about. And I think I just found it, in a coffee shop. And I would like, please, to be allowed to help. That's all. Let me see the bug.
Nell looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Hannah, who was nodding so hard her pencil fell out of her hair, and at Daniel, who had come in from the back room wiping his hands, and stood half in shadow with his careful, watchful, courteous stillness, and at Wyatt, who gave the smallest possible shrug, the shrug that meant, he checks out, and we can't hide forever, and you know it.
Hannah.
Nell said at last, with the air of a woman stepping off a high place.
Pull the cloth. Run the 4-minute.
He watched it run. He stood very still. For an old man, he had a great gift of stillness, Wyatt noted, almost as great as his own. And he watched the small chip under its dome of glass do, in 4 minutes, the work that the rack of humming, fan-screaming graphics processors against the far wall would have sweated over for the better part of a working day. There were no flashing lights. That was the eerie part, the part that Drummond would think about for the rest of his life. The revolution made no noise. There was only Hannah's quiet narration and the numbers ticking up a screen, and the soft glow, pale, cool, the precise color, Drummond thought, of moonlight on water, leaking out from under the edge of the glass dome where the light was doing the thinking. And at the end of it, Hannah reached over, almost tenderly, and laid her bare palm flat on the housing, and looked at him, and didn't say anything, because she didn't have to. He put out his own hand and touched it. It was barely warm. It was the temperature of a sleeping animal. It was the temperature of the future, and the future, it turned out, was cool to the touch. Calloway Drummond stood in the shed with his hand on the chip, and behind his quiet face the old prospector was no longer shaking. The old prospector had gone very calm and very clear, the way men go calm when the thing they have spent a life hunting is finally, actually in the pan. And he was thinking 3 thoughts at once, and the 3 thoughts were these. The first thought was, they have in this shed the single most valuable object on the planet, and they have no idea, none, what is about to happen to them. The second thought was, I can give it to them. The money, the lawyers, the walls. I can build the walls around this thing that these good and brilliant and hopelessly innocent children cannot build for themselves. I can make this real. It would be the best thing I ever did, and I would die having mattered. And the third thought, which arrived more slowly, and which made the back of his neck go cold even in the warm steel air of the shed, the third thought was a memory. It was a memory of a lunch, 11 years ago now, in a private room in Washington, with men who did not give him their full names, and a steak he had not tasted, and a question they had asked him then, when his own company had been doing something the government cared about. Mr. Drummond, do you understand what it means to possess something that a foreign state has decided it must have? Do you understand that the rules change? That you are no longer a businessman with a product, but a fortress with a flag, and that there are people, patient, professional, faceless people, whose entire profession is the taking of fortresses? He had nodded then, and not really understood, because it had been abstract, a briefing, a thing that happened to other people. It was not abstract now. It was sitting under a glass dome in a steel shed in Georgia, glowing the color of moonlight, barely warm to the touch. Drummond took his hand off the chip.
All right,
He said, and his voice was steady, and only Wyatt, watching, always watching, saw that something behind the old man's eyes had changed, had hardened, had become, very slightly, afraid.
all right, here's what I think. I think you are going to start a company. I think you are going to start it next week, because you do not have the luxury of next month. I think I am going to fund it, all of it, myself, so there are no other partners in the room asking questions. Not yet, and I think...
He looked around at the 4 of them, the prickly genius and the luminous girl, and the watchful, quiet one in the corner, and the still ex-soldier with the scar on his jaw. I think that before we do one single other thing, before the lawyers or the money or the dinner, I think we need to have a very serious conversation that none of you are going to enjoy. About locks, about who comes up that road, and about the fact that, as of about 4 minutes ago, every one of you became a person that certain other people in this world would consider it very much worth their while to lie to seduce, to bribe, to follow, and, I am not exaggerating, and I wish to God I were, to harm. He paused. because the rest of the world has not come up the road yet, but it is coming, and when it comes, it will not be eating pie. Outside, beyond the bright glass roof of the shed, the light was failing over the Georgia hills, and the cicadas, 3 weeks early, sang and sang and sang in the warm and gathering dark. Chapter 4. Cicada Systems. They started the company on a Tuesday. It happened, as these things truly happen, not in a flash of glory, but in a lawyer's strip mall office in Noonan, with bad fluorescent light and a water cooler that gurgled like a dying man, where a courtly old attorney named Mr. Pruitt, whom Drummond had produced out of his own deep south the way a magician produces a dove, slid documents across a laminate table and explained, in a voice like warm gravel, the difference between common and preferred shares to the 4 of them. 3 engineers who could have explained quantum tunneling to him, and 1 watchful security man who could not, all of whom went, on the subject of a capitalization table, equally helpless and trusting as children. Drummond watched the trust on their faces and felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders, and was glad of it. He had structured it so they kept control. He had structured it so that no one, not him, not any future investor, not a board he would handpick to protect them, could ever do to these 4 what had been done to Nell Vance in California. "You will thank me for this clause in 5 years," he told them, "and you will not understand it for 2. They signed. Hannah signed with a flourish and a whoop. Daniel signed carefully, reading every line, his courteous stillness intact. Nell signed last, and when she set the pen down, she looked, for one unguarded instant, like a woman who had just been handed back something that had been stolen from her a long time ago. They called it Cicada Systems. The name had been Hannah's, of course, half a joke about the bugs in the trees and half something truer, something about a thing that lives for years in the dark underground, patient, unseen, building toward a single, sudden, deafening emergence into the light. Drummond had wanted something grander. Wyatt had wanted, privately, something that sounded like nothing at all, a beige and forgettable name, because the first rule of the only profession he had ever truly mastered was, do not be interesting to look at. But Hannah had said cicada, and her eyes had lit, and that had been the end of the discussion, the way it usually was. They leased the shed and the half-acre of cleared ground around it from the college, which was so astonished to have a tenant that it nearly wept. Drummond's money, wired in from accounts with the soft, untraceable smoothness of very old wealth, bought, in the space of 3 weeks, a chain-link fence and then a real fence, cameras, a steel security door for the clean room that Wyatt specified down to the bolt pattern, a fabrication arrangement with a small, discreet, security-cleared specialty foundry in the desert outside Phoenix that could grow Hannah's lattices to a recipe without ever being told what the recipe was for. 2 more engineers, vetted to within an inch of their lives, and a great deal of coffee. And Wyatt Cole handed the college back its parking decals and its drunk freshmen and its propped fire doors, and became, on paper and in fact, Cicada Systems' head of security, the first such title he had ever held that came attached to something genuinely worth protecting, and the first, he thought, that he had any business being afraid of. And in those 3 bright weeks, before the dark came up the road, they were happy. Wyatt would remember that summer, later, the way men remember the last good summer before a war. Overbright, slowed down, almost unbearably precious in hindsight. The heat lay over the hills like a hand. The cicadas sang. And in the long gold evenings, when the others had gone, he and Hannah Reese fell, without either of them quite deciding to, into the oldest and most dangerous arrangement in the world. It began with the chip and stayed, for a while, decently disguised as work. She would stay late tuning the lattice, and he would stay late because he did not, anymore, sleep well. And they would find themselves at midnight sharing the last of Tamar's biscuits gone stale, and a bottle of the good bourbon Drummond had left for emergencies, sitting on the loading dock of the shed with their feet hanging over the warm concrete, and the whole black bowl of the Georgia night above them, loud with insects, and they would talk. She told him about the Gulf Coast, about a father who had crewed shrimp boats and a mother who had cleaned other people's beach houses, about being the strange brown girl who took the science fair too seriously, about the full scholarship and the loneliness of it, and the way light had become, for her, somewhere in there, a kind of religion. Do you know light is the only thing in the universe that everyone agrees on, Wyatt? Everybody in every reference frame measures it going the exact same speed. It's the one honest thing, the one thing that doesn't lie or slow down or play favorites. And he had listened to her the way he had once listened for the click of a pressure plate, with his whole body, and found that he could not stop. And one night she stopped, mid-sentence, the bourbon warm in both their hands, and looked at him in the dark and said, "You never talk about before, the army, whatever you did." "No." "Was it bad?" He looked out at the dark hills. "It was the kind of thing," he said finally, "that you do so that other people don't have to know it's the kind of thing that has to be done. And then you can't ever explain it to the people you did it for, because the whole point was that they'd never have to understand it." He turned the glass in his hand. "I came here to stop being that. To be a guy who solders things and reads Nell's papers and gets yelled at about cap tables. To be normal. I was doing pretty well at it, too." He looked at her. "Until you started saying numbers out loud in coffee shops." She laughed, that sudden, unguarded laugh that he felt in his sternum. And then she didn't laugh, and the cicadas sawed on, and the small distance between them on the warm concrete became, very slowly, no distance at all. He kissed her, or she kissed him. Afterward, neither could honestly say, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that for the length of that kiss, Wyatt Cole was not watching the tree line. For the length of that kiss, the perimeter was undefended. It was the only time all summer that it would be, and he would think about that, too, later, with the particular self-loathing of a professional who knows better. But that night he just held her, and she fit against him as though the universe had machined them to tolerance, and the future was cool to the touch and full of light. It was Daniel who saw the first car. Daniel Feng saw everything. It was his nature and, Wyatt would come to understand, his curse. He was 26, slight and precise, with round glasses and the gentlest manner of anyone Wyatt had ever met, and a mind that built software the way a watchmaker builds a movement. Every part necessary, every part beautiful, nothing left to chance. He had grown up in Chengdu, the only child of a widowed mother, a retired schoolteacher named Feng Lian, whom he telephoned every single Sunday morning, Georgia time, which was Sunday evening for her, and Wyatt had more than once come in early and found Daniel on the loading dock in the gray dawn, speaking softly into his phone in rapid Sichuanese, laughing at something, his whole careful face gone soft and young, and had felt, watching him, the particular tenderness one feels for a person who is decent in a world that does not reward it. It was on one of those gray Sunday mornings that Daniel mentioned the car.
"There is a grey sedan,"
He said to Wyatt, conversationally, putting away his phone.
"that is parked at the bottom of the ridge road 4 mornings this week. Out past the church. A man sits in it. He does not get out.
Daniel said it the way he might mention an interesting fault in a circuit.
Probably it is nothing. A real estate person, perhaps. They are always taking pictures of the farms out here. But you were a soldier, Wyatt, so I'm telling the soldier."
The small, cold drop in Wyatt's stomach, the one he trusted.
4 mornings.
Wyatt said.
4. Always between 5:40 and 7. Always the same car. I notice cars.
Daniel added, a little apologetically.
It is a habit from home. In China, you learn very young to notice who is sitting in a parked car. It is a thing my mother taught me, actually.
He smiled, but the smile had something underneath it that Wyatt, who knew the topography of underneaths, filed away without comment.
It is probably nothing.
It was not nothing. Wyatt drove down past the church the next morning at 5:30, in the dark before the dark gives up. And he parked his truck behind the feed store and he walked the rest of the way in the wet grass along the tree line, soundless, the old skill coming back into his body like a language he had pretended to forget. And at 5:48, a gray sedan came up the county road, slowed by the foot of the ridge and stopped. A man sat in it. He did not get out. He had a camera with a long lens resting on the steering wheel, and he was photographing the gate of Cicada systems, methodically, the way a man photographs a thing he has been told to photograph by someone he is afraid of. Wyatt memorized the plate. He memorized the man, Asian, 50s, soft, a salaryman's face, not a soldier's, a clerk's face, the face of someone doing a small, dangerous job for a large, dangerous reason. And then he walked back to his truck through the wet grass, and he sat in it for a long time as the light came up over the hills, and he did not feel the thing he had expected to feel, which was fear. He felt the other thing, the old thing, the thing he had come to Georgia specifically to never feel again. He felt useful. God help him, he thought, watching the gray sedan finally pull away. God help all of us, because the rest of the world has come up the road, and it turns out I have been waiting for it. Chapter 5. A Visitor from Singapore. The man who arrived at the gate of Cicada Systems 11 days later did not photograph anything. He did not need to. He had been invited. His card said, David Hahn, and beneath that, partner, and beneath that, in a restrained gray serif, Lotus Pacific Capital, Singapore, Palo Alto, Shenzhen. The card was beautiful. Everything about David Hahn was beautiful in the same restrained, expensive, frictionless way. The charcoal suit cut close in the modern manner, the open-collared white shirt, the soft Italian shoes, the watch. Wyatt clocked it instantly, helplessly, the habit now fully reawakened. A steel sports watch of staggering and understated cost, the kind a certain breed of global money wore as a passport. He was perhaps 50. He had silver coming in at the temples of very black hair, a face of carved and pleasant planes, and eyes of a pale, clear gray so unusual against his coloring that they stopped you, made you look twice, made you, and this, Wyatt would understand far too late, was precisely their purpose. Trust him, because surely a man would not go through life with eyes that strange and remarkable if he had anything to hide. He had reached out to Drummond, not the other way around. That was the first thing. A warm, brief, perfectly pitched email. A fellow traveler in the world of deep technology, an admirer of Mr. Drummond's legendary career, in Atlanta for a few days on other business, would be honored, no obligation, no pitch, to pay his respects and perhaps learn what the great man was excited about these days. It was flattery so well machined that even Drummond, who had been flattered professionally for 40 years and prided himself on his immunity, had found himself agreeing to a coffee before he'd quite decided to.
I checked him out,
Drummond told Wyatt the morning of the visit.
Lotus Pacific is real. Mid-sized, smart, low profile. Exactly the kind of fun that gets into things early and quietly. Hahn's name is on a dozen deals, all legitimate, all photonics or advanced materials or chips. He's done very well. There's nothing on him.
Drummond paused.
Which is itself a thing if you think about it. A man does 8, 10 years of deals, and there's nothing? No bad blood, no lawsuit, no enemy who talk. Either he's a saint, or he's very, very careful about the trail. I've been both in my time. I know what careful looks like.
Then why are we meeting him?
Because,
Said Drummond simply.
we're going to need money. Real money. Mountains of it. The kind I alone cannot provide. To build a foundry and take this to the world. And that money is going to come, when it comes, with hands attached to it. And some of those hands are going to be exactly like David Hahn's. I would rather meet the danger over a nice lunch where I can watch his hands than meet it in a term sheet.
He looked at Wyatt. And I would like you in the room. Not to talk, to watch. You see things I don't. You've been seeing things all summer that you haven't told me about, son, and I'd appreciate it if that stopped. But for today, just watch him and tell me after what you saw. So Wyatt watched him. They lunched at the inn out toward Serenby, the one good restaurant for 20 miles, all reclaimed barnwood and farm-to-table earnestness, and a wine list that Drummond approved of with a single raised eyebrow. And David Hahn was, for 90 minutes, the single most charming human being Wyatt Cole had ever been in a room with. He did not pitch. That was the artistry of it. He asked questions, and he listened to the answers with a still, total, flattering attention, his strange gray eyes on whoever was speaking. And he knew everything. He spoke about photonic computing with a fluency that made even Nell sit up, dropping a remark here about waveguide losses, there about the thermal stability of phase change media, that revealed a mind that had clearly at some point done real physics and not just read about it on airplanes. He drew Nell out brilliantly. He drew Hannah out, too easily, Wyatt thought, watching her light up under that gray-eyed attention, and feeling something that he was honest enough with himself to name as jealousy, and disciplined enough to set aside. He was deferent to Drummond, funny about Singapore, self-deprecating about his own failures, generous with credit. He mentioned, lightly, that he had grown up in Hong Kong and studied in California, and that his fund was
Deliberately small. Deliberately patient. I have no interest in the circus, Mr. Drummond, the unicorns and the magazine covers. I am interested only in the things that change the physics of the world. There are perhaps 3 such things in a generation. I have spent my life hunting them.
His gray eyes moved just once across the table, and there was in them, for less than a second, a hunger so naked and so old that Wyatt felt the hair lift on his arms. And then it was gone, folded back behind the charm, and Hahn was laughing at something Hannah had said. He did not ask to see the chip. That was the other thing. He came nowhere near it. A lesser operator would have angled all lunch for an invitation to the lab. David Hahn talked about everything except getting into the lab, and let the not asking do the work. Let them feel that he was the rare investor who respected the science, who would never be so crude as to push. So that by the end of lunch it was Nell, of all people, prickly fortress Nell, who heard herself saying,
Well, if you're still in town tomorrow, I suppose we could show you the test rig.
and saw it too late. The flicker of pure triumph crossed those gray eyes before he demurred modestly that he wouldn't dream of imposing, that perhaps another time. He was, in short, perfect. And that was what Wyatt told Drummond, afterward, in the cream-colored Mercedes in the gravel lot when the others had gone.
He's perfect,
Wyatt said,
every move. He never once put a foot wrong. He knew exactly how much physics to show to make Nell respect him, and exactly how little to ask to make her trust him. He let her invite him to the lab so it'd be her idea. He didn't touch his wine, watched all of us drink, and never touched his own glass. Did you see that? Stayed sharp while he loosened us up. And his hands.
Wyatt stopped. His hands, what? His right hand. Wyatt looked out at the green hills. There's a tremor in it, fine, fast, constant. He keeps it under the table or covers it with the other one, smooth as anything. You'd never notice unless you were looking for the thing he was hiding. And there's a burn scar on the inside of that wrist. Old, the kind you get from a furnace or a fire. He turned to Drummond. Cal, that's a lab burn. That man wasn't just a physics tourist. At some point in his life, David Hahn stood close enough to a chemical furnace to take fire to the wrist. He built things with his hands, and then he stopped and started buying other people's things instead. And somewhere in there, he learned to be perfect, and a man does not learn to be that perfect in venture capital. Drummond was very still in the driver's seat. "What are you telling me, son?"
I'm telling you,
said Wyatt Cole.
that I have met perfect men before. In another life. In rooms in other countries. And in my experience, Cal, there is only one profession on earth that produces men that perfect, that careful, with a trail that clean and a cover that good, and a hunger they can't quite keep out of their eyes.
He watched a hawk turn, high and slow, over the kudzu-shrouded bottoms.
And it isn't the venture capital business.
Chapter 6. The Honey and the Trap. After that, they came in earnest, and they came the way the professionals always come. Not at the wall, which is watched, but at the gates that no one thinks to guard, the soft, human gates of loneliness and pride and love and fear. There were 3 approaches that summer, and Wyatt caught 2 of them, and the one he did not catch was the one that nearly killed them all. The first came for Wyatt himself, and it was almost an insult. Her name, she said, was Sloan, and she was a freelance technology journalist doing a piece on the new American hardware renaissance. And she found Wyatt at Hazel's on a Thursday, and she was very good, genuinely good. Good enough that on another man, a man who had not spent 2 years of his life being taught the precise anatomy of this exact maneuver by humorless instructors at a facility that did not officially exist, it would have worked. She was beautiful in an accessible, unintimidating, girl-next-door way that was itself a kind of tell. True honey traps are rarely bombshells. Bombshells are remembered. And she was interested in him, specifically, in his service, in his quiet competence, in the scar on his jaw, leaning in, finding reasons to touch his forearm, asking with breathless admiration about the security side of a company like Cicada. I mean, you must be the one keeping the whole thing safe. That's such an incredible responsibility. How do you even think about a threat like that? Wyatt bought her a coffee and flirted back exactly enough to keep her hook in the water so he could study the line, and gave her precisely nothing, and walked her to her car and memorized that plate too. Then he went home and confirmed in 20 minutes that no journalist named Sloan had written anything, anywhere, ever. The legend was thin, hastily built. Whoever ran her had been in a hurry, or had not expected the target to check. It was the not expecting that chilled him. It meant they thought he was soft. It meant they had read him as a small-town rent-a-cop with a military hobby. It meant their file on Wyatt Cole was wrong. And a wrong file, Wyatt knew, was the single most useful thing a hunted man could possess. He resolved, then, to keep it wrong as long as he possibly could. To stay slow, to stay invisible, to be underestimated for exactly as long as it took. The second approach came for Nell, and it was cleverer, and it came dressed as an honor, an invitation to give a keynote at a prestigious materials science conference in Singapore, all expenses paid, an honorarium that made her laugh out loud, the whole thing arranged by a foundation with an impeccable name. Wyatt killed it before she could accept.
You are not getting on a plane to Singapore,
He said flatly, and when she drew breath to object, he added quietly,
No. The man who runs Lotus Pacific Capital is based in Singapore. You would land in his city, exhausted, jet-lagged, surrounded by his people, asked admiring questions about your work at 100 receptions by strangers you'd never be able to fully check. There are countries you do not travel to right now. Singapore is friendly, but it is a crossroads, and a crossroads is exactly where a thing like this likes to do its business. On neutral ground where no one's quite in charge.
She had stared at him, and something in his certainty had frightened her into silence, and she had declined the keynote, and 3 days later the Foundation's website quietly removed her from the program, as though she had never been invited at all, which was the most frightening part. The third approach, the one Wyatt did not catch, did not come for Wyatt or for Nell. It came for Daniel, and it came wearing the face of kindness. Her name was Professor Shen Mei Ling, and she was, the college announced with delight, a distinguished visiting scholar in the humanities. A gentle, white-haired woman in her late 60s, a specialist in classical Chinese poetry, here for a single semester on an exchange that no one could quite remember arranging, but that came with its own funding, which silenced all questions. She was grandmotherly. She was beloved within a week. She brought homemade dumplings to the faculty lounge and pressed oranges on the students, and laughed easily, and asked after everyone's families, and the small, lonely population of Chinese international students at Caldwell, there were 11 of them, gathered to her like ducklings, and to none of them more gratefully than Daniel Feng, who was so far from home, and who had not eaten his mother's cooking in 3 years. She fed him. That was all at first. She fed him, and she spoke to him in the dialect of home, and she asked about his mother. Your good mother, all alone in Chengdu, how is her health? A son should not be so far from his only mother. And she listened to him talk about his work with the warm, vague, admiring incomprehension of an old literature professor. And Daniel, who telephoned his mother every Sunday because he was drowning in homesickness, was given, in Auntie Shen, a small, warm island of home in the strange, dry sea of Georgia, and he loved her for it, helplessly and gratefully, the way the lonely love anyone who is kind to them. She did not ask him for anything, not for a long time. She was very patient. She was, after all, a professional, and she had broken better men than Daniel Feng, and she knew that the trap with the strongest grip is the one that takes the longest to close, that you do not ask the homesick boy for the secret, you simply become, slowly, over warm weeks, the only home he has. And then, one day, when he can no longer imagine the cold of losing you, you weep a little, and you tell him about a difficulty, a terrible difficulty, that has befallen the people you both love, and you let him understand, without your ever having to say it, that he and he alone can make it stop. The difficulty arrived in October in the form of a photograph. It was a photograph of his mother, Fang Lian, on the street outside her apartment block in Chengdu, with her string bag of vegetables, looking up. And the angle of it, the long lens, the fact that it existed at all, that someone had stood across the road and photographed his frail, widowed mother going to the market, made the bottom drop out of Daniel Feng's world before Auntie Shen had said a single word. She wept when she showed it to him. She was very good. She wept, and she held his hands in her soft old hands, and she told him that there were men, bad men. She had nothing to do with them. She was only a poor old teacher of poems. But there were men who had means, who had taken an interest, who had certain expectations, and that they had reached out to her only because she was close to him, because they thought a fellow countryman, an auntie, might explain the situation more gently than they would. And the situation, she wept, was simply this, that his mother's safety, her pension, her continued freedom to walk to the market with her string bag in the autumn light, all of it now rested, through no fault of his own, on Daniel's willingness to share, quietly, with people who would never trouble him again afterward, The details of the work he did in the steel shed on the hill. "It is not even spying," she whispered, gripping his hands, her old eyes streaming. "It is science. Science belongs to all the world, child. You yourself have said so. Has not your own Dr. Reese said that light is the one honest thing that belongs to everyone? You would only be helping it to belong to everyone a little sooner. And your mother, your good mother, would be safe. That is all they want. A small thing to keep a great thing safe." Daniel Feng sat in the visiting scholar's borrowed office, looking at the photograph of his mother in the autumn light, and he understood, with the terrible clarity of a man watching a door close that he will never open again, several things at once. He understood that Auntie Shen had never once been his friend. He understood that there was no version of the next year in which he was not a traitor to his country of birth, or to his friends, or to his mother, and that he would have to choose which. And he understood, with a grief so total it felt almost like calm, that he could tell no one. Not Wyatt, who was a soldier and would call the FBI and turn Daniel into a case, a defector, a man who could never go home and whose mother would pay the price within the week. Not Nell, who would be destroyed by the betrayal. Not Hannah, who was too open to carry such a weight without it showing on her honest face. He was alone with it, the way he had been alone in the gray Georgia dawns on the loading dock, except that now the voice on the phone on Sunday mornings was a hostage, and every Sunday he would have to be cheerful for her, so that she would not know. "All right," Daniel Feng heard himself say, very quietly, in the dialect of home. "All right, tell me what they want." Auntie Shen squeezed his hands, and her tears dried with a speed that, had he been watching, would have told him everything. But he was not watching. He was looking at the photograph. Outside, the first cold front of the autumn was coming down out of the mountains, and the cicadas, at last, had fallen silent. Chapter 7. Old Habits. Wyatt found the device on a Sunday night, and finding it changed everything, because a device is a fact, and you cannot argue with a fact the way you can argue with a feeling. He had taken to sweeping the shed himself, late, when the others were gone, not with anything so crude as store-bought gear, but with patience and a flashlight and the methodical, inch-by-inch discipline of a man who had once cleared rooms for a living, who knew where things are hidden because he had hidden things himself, in rooms in other countries, in lives he did not discuss. For weeks he had found nothing, and had begun, against his own judgment, to hope. And then, on the second Sunday of October, behind the faceplate of a wall outlet in the clean room, the holy of holies, the one space they all believed was sealed, his fingers found a small, flat, foreign weight that did not belong to any outlet ever manufactured, and he went very still, crouched there in the dark with his flashlight, and felt the last of the summer drain out of his body. It was good. That was the thing that frightened him. He had seen a lot of audio devices in his time, and this was not a hobbyist's toy from the internet. It was small and well made, and it ran on the mains power of the very outlet it hid behind so that it would never need a battery changed, and it was the work of a state. He left it exactly where it was. You do not pull the hook the moment you feel it. An amateur pulls the hook. A professional studies the line. And he photographed it, and he sat on the cold, clean room floor in the dark for a long time. And then he called Calloway Drummond at 11 o'clock at night and said 4 words.
"It's real. Come now."
It got worse before Drummond arrived. Wyatt was crossing the dark yard between the clean room and the loading dock when the old animal at the base of his skull, the one that had kept him alive in places with no names, told him he was not alone, and he was already moving, dropping, turning, when the man came out of the shadow of the propane tank. He was good, too, bigger than Wyatt, and fast and silent, and he came in low and hard with something short and dark in his fist. And there were no words. There was never going to be any conversation, because this man had not come to talk. This man had been sent to recover the listening device that the team's new pet soldier had apparently, finally, gotten close to finding, and to make sure the soldier did not get to tell anyone about it. What happened next happened in the dark in about 4 seconds, and Wyatt would not afterward be able to fully reconstruct it, because that part of him did not narrate, it simply did, the body remembering what the mind had tried so hard to forget. He went inside the arc of the blade instead of away from it, which is the thing every nerve in a normal man screams against, and the thing he had been broken and rebuilt to do. And there was a wet shock of impact along his ribs that he registered as information and not as pain. And then he had the wrist, and then he had the elbow, and there was a sound like a green branch breaking, and the dark thing fell on the concrete, and the big man made a high, thin sound through his teeth. And Wyatt Cole, who soldiers things and reads Nell's papers, and came to Georgia to never do this again, put him down on the concrete with a precision that was its own kind of mercy and its own kind of horror, and knelt on him in the dark with his forearm across the man's throat at the exact pressure that means unconsciousness in 8 seconds, and not the other pressure, the one he had also been taught, and held him there, breathing hard, while the man's struggles slowed and stopped. He did not kill him. He noted, with a cold and distant interest, how close he had come to it, how easy it would have been, how the body had wanted to. He had come to Georgia to stop being a man who knew that about himself. He was not going to get to keep that. He understood that now, kneeling in the dark on the chest of an unconscious foreign agent, with blood, his own, the cut along his ribs, shallow, he'd live, soaking warm into his shirt and the propane tank ticking as it cooled, and the cicadas, for the first time all year, utterly silent. He had come to Georgia to lay the weapon down. The world had reached into Georgia and put it back in his hand. When Drummond arrived 20 minutes later, he found Wyatt sitting on the loading dock with a zip-tied prisoner beside him and a bath towel pressed to his own ribs, and the old man got out of the cream-colored Mercedes and stood looking at the scene in the wash of his headlights, and something passed over his face, grief mostly, the grief of a man who has just watched a thing he feared become a thing that is, and he said, very quietly, "Well, I suppose the dinner's off." And Wyatt Cole laughed, a short, hard, exhausted laugh that hurt his ribs, and that was the moment the two of them stopped being a young company's founder and its head of security, and became, instead, what they would be for the rest of it. Two old soldiers of two different wars, sitting in the dark with a problem, deciding what to do.
"I can't sit on this, Cal,"
Wyatt said.
"I want to. Believe me. The second we make a phone call, this stops being ours. It becomes the government's. There'll be agents in the shed. There'll be classifications. There'll be men in cheap suits telling Nell what she can and can't publish about her own life's work. We lose control of it, the thing you structured the whole company to keep us in control of. I know that. But I caught a man with a knife in our yard tonight, and there is a state-grade microphone in our clean room, and the next person they send is not going to come at me."
He looked at Drummond. "They're going to come at Hannah, or Nell, or whoever's softest, and I cannot be everywhere. I am one man, and they are a government. I need help, the kind of help that I cannot buy with even your money. I need the United States." Drummond was quiet for a long moment, looking at the prisoner, looking at the blood on Wyatt's shirt, looking up the dark ridge at the lights of the little college that had no idea what had taken root on its hill.
"I made a phone call once,"
He said finally.
11 years ago, that I have regretted for 11 years, because it let the government into something of mine, and they never quite left. So I know exactly what I'm asking you to give up."
He took out his phone, an old one, Wyatt noticed, scuffed, the phone of a man who did not care to be current, and scrolled slowly to a number that did not have a name attached to it, only a single letter. But you're right, and there's a man I trust from the bad old days. He won't be the one who shows up. He's too senior to show up. But if I call him, the person who does show up will be the right person, and they'll come quietly, and they'll understand what's at stake, which is more than I can say for whoever you'd get by dialing the front door. He looked at Wyatt. You sure?
No,
Wyatt said honestly.
but do it anyway.
Drummond made the call. Chapter 8. Special Agent Cruz. She came alone 3 days later in a gray sedan so anonymous it was practically a statement, and she was nothing like what Nell had expected, which was the first point in her favor. Special Agent Renata Cruz was 40, compact, with dark hair pulled back hard, and the flat, patient, watchful eyes of someone who had spent 15 years learning that the world is almost never what it advertises. She had grown up in El Paso, the daughter of a border patrol agent and a school teacher, and she had joined the Bureau out of a kind of stubbornness she had stopped trying to explain. And she had washed up, by a route too long to recount, in the counterintelligence squad of the Atlanta field office, where she spent her days on the least glamorous and most important work the Bureau did. The slow, grinding, frustrating, almost entirely invisible business of catching the men and women who came, quietly, year after year, to steal the things that made America rich, and to hand them to states that wished America were not. She did not introduce herself as FBI for the first 10 minutes. She let Drummond's vouching do that. She sat in the shed with a cup of Tamar's coffee and looked at the listening device. Wyatt had finally pulled it after photographing every angle, turning it over in a gloved hand with the unhurried interest of a jeweler examining a stone. And then she set it down on the steel table and looked at the four of them. And she said, I'm going to tell you some things, and I need you to not panic, because panic is exactly what gets people in your situation hurt. Can you do that? She did not wait for an answer. This, she nudged the device, is MSS, Ministry of State Security. I'd put my pension on it. It's not the kind of thing a competitor buys off a website. It's the kind of thing a government issues, which means you are not dealing with industrial espionage. You are dealing with a foreign intelligence service that has decided your company is a national priority target. And I want to be very precise about something, because people get this wrong, and it matters. Her flat eyes moved over them and stopped, for just a moment, on Daniel, who had gone very still in his corner. The People's Republic of China is not the Chinese people. The men running this operation answer to the party, not to the billion human beings the party rules. My own partner's family fled that exact apparatus 3 generations ago. He'd tell you himself, and he'll be working this case with me. So nobody in this room is going to start looking sideways at every Chinese name they meet, because that's not justice, and it's also, tactically, exactly the stupidity they're counting on. We're hunting an operation, not an ethnicity. Are we clear?
We're clear.
Nell said, and Wyatt saw her shoulders come down an inch and understood that Cruz had said it for Nell and for the 11 Chinese students up the hill, and most of all, though she could not have known it, for Daniel Feng, who sat in his corner with his hands folded and his courteous face composed and his heart breaking, because he understood, listening to this fair and decent woman, exactly how completely he had already failed her.
Good.
Said Cruz.
Now, here's the part you'll like even less. We could roll this up tomorrow. We could arrest your propane tank friend, who is, by the way, refusing to say a word, very professional, very PLA, And we could declare your investor, Mr. Hahn, a person of interest and watch him get on the next flight to a country we can't follow him into. And we could put a security detail on you and call it a win.
She let that sit. And it would be a terrible win, because they just learn what tipped us, fix it, and come back in 18 months with a better cover, and we'd be blind. The technology is the prize, and the prize isn't going anywhere. It's in Dr. Reese's head and on a server in that room. So they will never stop coming. Not ever. Not as long as it exists.
Then what?
Said Wyatt, who already knew, because he had run the same logic on the loading dock at midnight.
Do we do instead?
Renata Cruz almost smiled. Mr. Drummond said you were the smart one. She leaned forward.
We don't slam the door. We hold it open. We let them keep thinking they're winning. Let them keep their microphone. Let them keep running their assets. Let them keep believing we don't see them. And we watch. We map the whole network. Who's running it? Who's been recruited? Where the take is going? What the end game is? And when they make their move for the crown jewels, and they will, the pressure's too high now for them to be patient forever. We'll be standing exactly where they're going, and we'll take the whole thing down at once. The handler, the network, the product they think they're stealing.
She looked at Wyatt. But I can't do it from a desk in Atlanta. I need eyes and ears on the inside, in real time. Someone they've already underestimated. Someone who can see tradecraft when it walks past and not flinch. Mr. Drummond's friend tells me you used to be very good at a very specific job. Her flat, patient eyes held his. I think you still are. I think you've been doing it all summer. And I'm not going to ask you to be a hero, Mr. Cole, because heroes get people killed. I'm going to ask you to be patient, which is much harder and much more useful and a lot more dangerous to your soul. She extended her hand. Will you work with me? Wyatt looked at the hand. He looked at Hannah, who was watching him with naked fear and naked love, who knew, they all knew now, that the man she had kissed on the loading dock in the warm dark was not, and had never been, just a guy who soldered things. That there was a war in him that the world had reached in and switched back on. He thought about the thing he had felt in his truck by the church, watching the gray sedan pull away. The thing he was ashamed of. Useful.
Yeah, said Wyatt Cole, and took her hand. I'll work with you.
And in his corner, his hands folded, his face a courteous mask over a falling world, Daniel Feng watched the soldier shake hands with the FBI and understood that the net he was caught in had just grown a second set of jaws, pulling from the opposite direction, and that he was the one thread tied to both, and that sooner or later, when the two great forces pulled hard enough, the thread was going to be the thing that broke. He went home that night and could not eat. On Sunday, he telephoned his mother and made her laugh, and listened to her tell him about the persimmons that were ripe in the courtyard, and stood on the loading dock in the cold dark long after he had hung up, looking up the ridge at the lights of the little college, and he wept, very quietly, where no one could see, the way the lonely weep. And then he wiped his face and squared his careful shoulders and went in, because on Monday they wanted the first files, and his mother was alone in Chengdu with the ripe persimmons, and Daniel Feng had run out of ways to be a good man. Chapter 9. The Demonstration. By midwinter, the secret had a shape too large to hide, and a company too valuable to ignore, and so, over Wyatt's strenuous objection and at Drummond's insistence, Cicada Systems prepared to step, for one carefully stage-managed hour, into the light.
We have no choice,
Drummond told the room.
I know how you feel, Wyatt. I'd keep this thing in a hole in the ground for another 2 years if I could. But we are burning money at a rate even I can feel, and to build a real foundry, to take this to the scale it needs, we need a serious round, hundreds of millions. And serious money does not invest in a rumor in a shed. They need to see it. Not the recipe. God, never the recipe. But the result? We show them the bug runs faster than the gods and cooler than a creek behind glass, with not one word about how, and we let the market do what the market does. We need a demonstration.
He had a way of pronouncing it with a capital letter. Controlled, invitation only, 40 people in a room who could write the checks that changed the world. And he looked at Cruz, who had become, in those months, a near-permanent gray-suited presence. 40 people, every one of whom Agent Cruz here will have vetted down to their dental records. Because we know who's going to want an invitation. David Hahn wanted an invitation. He got one. That had been Cruz's call, and it had been a cold one.
Of course we invite him.
She'd said.
If we leave him off the list, he knows we're on to him. We invite him, we seat him where my people can watch every twitch, and we learn what he does when he thinks he's in the room with the thing he spent a year trying to steal. A man tells you everything by how he behaves around the thing he wants most.
She'd looked at Wyatt. Your job that day isn't security. We'll have security. Your job is to stand near David Hahn and watch his hands. They held it on a clear, cold day in February in the college's old chapel hall. Drummond's theatrical instinct again. He had wanted columns and history and the wrong clock, wanted the gleaming, impossible future framed by 100 years of brick and ivy. And he had been right. It landed exactly as he'd known it would. And for 1 hour, in front of 40 of the most powerful people in technology and finance, the little chip that Hannah Reese had grown in a shed in Georgia did the thing it did, behind a wall of glass, while the rack of the world's best graphics processors strained and roared and sweated alongside it, and lost, and lost, and lost. It was not a noisy triumph. Hannah ran it herself, in a plain dark dress, with a quiet competence that was 100 times more convincing than any showman's patter, and she narrated the benchmarks in a voice that did not push, and she let the numbers climb the great screen, the training step, then inference, the same brutal yardstick the giants lived and died by, and beside each one the power draw, a rounding error against the roaring white-hot racks. And when she reached the end, when she said simply,
And the housing temperature, as you can see, never exceeded 31 degrees Celsius. You could hold it in your hand
and put up the live thermal image of the chip, glowing cool and serene beside its screaming, white-hot, power-guzzling competitors. There was, in the old chapel hall, a silence. It was the silence of 40 extremely wealthy people simultaneously recalculating the entire value of the modern world. It was the silence Drummond had felt in the coffee shop, multiplied by 40 and by billions of dollars. And it broke into a sound. Not applause, something stranger, a kind of collective exhalation, half wonder and half fear. And Calloway Drummond, standing at the back of the hall, felt tears come into his old eyes, because he had spent a long and tedious life looking for one more thing to give a damn about. And here it was, glowing the color of moonlight in the brick hall where boys had once learned Greek. And he had helped, and he had mattered. And whatever happened now, he had mattered. Wyatt Cole did not watch the chip. He watched David Hahn. Hahn sat in the third row, perfectly composed, his strange gray eyes on the great screen, applauding lightly with the others, the very picture of an impressed investor. And Wyatt, standing against the wall 10 feet away with the stillness of a man who has done this before, watched the right hand, watched it through the whole hour, and saw the thing he had come to see. When Hannah put up the thermal image, when the secret of the heat was, for one instant, made visible on the screen, the cool, serene glow of it laid bare for any expert eye to read. David Hahn's right hand, resting on his knee, began to tremble. Not the small, constant background tremor Wyatt had clocked at the lunch. A new thing, a surge, the involuntary tremor of pure, overwhelming desire. the hand of a starving man at a feast he is forbidden to touch. And Han covered it instantly with his left, smooth as ever, his face never moving, never giving a flicker. But the hand had spoken. The hand had told the truth that the perfect face would never tell. And what it said was, "I will have this, whatever it costs, whoever it costs. I will have this." Wyatt felt the small, cold drop in his stomach, the one he trusted, and he understood that the patient game had a clock on it now, and that the clock had just started running, because he had seen, on a trembling hand in the third row of a chapel hall, the exact moment a careful man stopped being patient. Afterward, in the reception, champagne and brilliant talk and the most powerful people in the world clustering around Nell like courtiers. Nell, who had been passed over and overlooked and stolen from, and who stood now flushed and vindicated and 10 years younger. David Hahn made his way, eventually, gracefully, to Hannah Reese and took both her hands in his, and his gray eyes were warm and his voice was low and sincere. And Wyatt, drifting close, heard him say, "Dr. Reese, what you have made is the most beautiful thing I have seen in 30 years. I mean that without flattery. I have given my whole life to the search for beautiful things, and this is the most beautiful. And I want to tell you something, scientist to scientist, because I think you, of all people, will understand it." His gray eyes held hers. "A thing this beautiful does not belong to a company or a country. It is too important for that. It belongs to the world, to all of humanity, to everyone, everywhere, the way you yourself have said light belongs to everyone." He smiled, gently. "I would so love to talk with you about that someday, about what it really means to give a gift like this to the whole world, without the walls, without the flags, just the light. May I call on you?" And Hannah Reese, open-hearted, brilliant, exhausted, flushed with the most important night of her life, looking into those strange and remarkable gray eyes that surely could hide nothing, felt, against every loyalty, a small, treacherous flower of agreement open somewhere in her chest, because it was her idea he was quoting back to her, her own most cherished idea. Light is the one honest thing that belongs to everyone. And across the room, Wyatt Cole, watching, felt the floor tilt under him, because he understood with sudden total clarity that the cleverest trap of all had never been laid for Daniel, or for Nell, or for him. It had just been laid, with exquisite care, for the woman he loved. And it had been baited with the one thing in the world she could not refuse, the truth. Chapter 10. The Flower and the Truth. The trouble with the truth, Wyatt was learning, is that a clever enough liar never has to lie at all. He need only find a truth you already love and hold it up and let you mistake his hand for your own. David Hahn had found Hannah's truth, and he held it up all that long, cold spring in a correspondence Wyatt could not stop because nothing in it was, technically, wrong. There were no secrets in it. Cruz read every word. Hannah, to her credit, had handed over the first message herself with a kind of defiant openness and found nothing but ideas. Beautiful, dangerous, seductive ideas about openness, about science as the common inheritance of all mankind, about the moral poverty of locking the light away behind one nation's flag and one company's lawyers. Hahn wrote like a philosopher. He quoted the great open scientists of history, the ones who had given away the atom and the double helix and asked for nothing. He never once asked for a single technical detail. He asked only that Hannah think, and Hannah Reese, who had been told her whole life that light belonged to everyone, found in David Hahn the first powerful person who seemed to agree, and it worked on her as nothing cruder ever could have. "He's not wrong, Wyatt," she said one cold night on the loading dock where they had once been so happy and where now a careful, miserable distance sat between them.
That's the thing you won't hear. Forget who you think he is for 1 second. Just the idea. Why should this be a weapon? Why should the most beautiful thing in physics get swallowed by the Pentagon and the export lawyers and turned into another club for one country to hit another with? We could give it away. We could publish the whole architecture tomorrow, and the entire human race would be 1,000 times richer by Christmas. Instead, we're building fences and meeting the FBI, and you walk around like we're at war.
"We are at war," Wyatt said quietly. "You're at war. You came here at war and you never stopped. And now you've got me at war and Nell at war. And I can't tell anymore whether there's actually a spy or whether you just need there to be one. Because a man who only knows how to be a soldier will find a war wherever he stands." She was crying, angrily, and it was the worst thing he had ever heard, because it was not entirely untrue. "I miss who you were before you found the microphone. Was he even real? Or was the guy who soldered things just another cover, another legend, like that woman who pretended to be a journalist?"
He was real,
Wyatt said, and his voice cracked, just slightly. The only crack he would allow himself.
He was the realest thing I ever got to be, and you're the reason. And I cannot lose him or you. And the only way to keep both is to win a war you don't believe in.
He could not tell her the operation. He could not tell her about Daniel, whom he had begun, in the long, sleepless nights, to suspect, and could not bear to. He could not say that the FBI was running a double game, because the game lived or died on no one knowing, and her honest face could not hold a secret that size. "I'm asking you to trust me with the parts you can't see, just for a while, the way you trusted me on this dock before you knew any of it. Can you do that?" And Hannah Reese looked at him a long time in the cold and said,
I don't know.
It was the truest answer she could have given, and it was the one that hurt most. The world, meanwhile, had begun to come up the road in earnest, and not all of it was hostile, and that was its own danger. A delegation came from Washington, not spies these, but the other arm of the same body, a courteous, immovable man from the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, and with him a colonel from a defense office whose name was a string of initials. They sat in the shed and drank Tamar's coffee and explained, gently and without the smallest room for argument, that the Cicada architecture had become, by a classified determination, a matter of national security, that it would be placed under export control, meaning the company could not sell it, license it, or meaningfully describe it to a long and lengthening list of foreign nationals and nations without the permission of the United States, and that the government was, by the way, extremely interested in a partnership, funding, protection, scale, a foundry on American soil with American clearances, on terms that would be generous and that everyone in the room understood were not entirely optional. Nell hated it. Hannah was sickened. It was the exact opposite of everything Han had whispered, the light in the vault, the gift turned into the club. Drummond, who had been here before, 11 years before, only nodded slowly and poured the colonel more coffee, because he understood it was the price, that it had always been going to be the price, that the moment Hannah said the number out loud in the coffee shop, the company had stopped belonging entirely to them and started belonging, a little, to the country whose hills it sat on, and that there were far worse fates than the protection of a great and flawed and democratic nation, as anyone who had studied the alternative could tell you. And Wyatt understood the geometry of it. The export controls meant the technology was about to become unobtainable by any legal means, locked, classified, walled, which meant that for Hanzi Yu and Auntie Shen and the patient men in the windowless room 8,000 miles away, the legal road had just closed forever. No more buying their way in, no more open science seduction toward a friendly licensing deal. The door was being welded shut by the United States itself, which meant they would have to take it by force, and soon, before the welding was done. That night, Wyatt called Cruz and told her his read, and there was a silence. And then Renata Cruz said, in her flat, patient voice,
I had the same thought driving home. The controls go to interagency review next month. If they move before that. We've got weeks, maybe less.
a pause.
Mr. Cole, I need you to do the thing I've been dreading. I need you to find out, fast, whether they have someone inside. Because if they grab the crown jewels, they can't do it from a parked car. They'll need a hand on the inside to hand them the real thing and not a decoy. And if there's a hand inside that shed,
She did not finish it. She did not have to. Wyatt was already, with a slow and terrible reluctance, thinking about the gray Georgia dawns, and a soft voice speaking Sichuanese into a telephone, and a courteous, breaking face in the corner of every meeting. Chapter 11. What the Hand Knew. He set the trap with watermarks in the end, an old idea in new clothes, the canary in the mine, the marked banknote, and it was Hannah's own architecture that made it possible, though Hannah never knew. Working alone at night, with Cruz's technical people on a secure line, Wyatt seeded the company's most sensitive design files with a constellation of tiny, deliberate, individually tailored falsehoods. A calibration constant off by a hair here, a fictitious processing step there, each variant unique, each one a fingerprint, so that any document that leaked into the world would carry, invisibly, the signature of the exact person who had held that exact copy. It was a slow trap. It depended on the leak surfacing where Cruz could see it. For 2 weeks it caught nothing, and Wyatt began, against his own judgment, to hope he was wrong about the gray dawns and the soft voice on the telephone. Then Cruz called at 4 in the morning, and her flat voice was very gentle, which was how he knew. She read him a string of numbers her people had pulled from an intercepted communication, en route to a server that traced, through 4 countries, back to the windowless building in Shanghai, and the numbers carried a fingerprint, and the fingerprint belonged to one of 3 people who had held that copy, and Wyatt closed his eyes in the dark, because he already knew which of the 3 it was. He had known for weeks, in the place below thought, and had been praying he was wrong.
it could still be one of the new engineers.
Cruz said,
We can't be certain from this alone.
"It's Daniel." The line was quiet.
I think you'd better let me handle this the right way.
Cruz said carefully.
Procedurally. We bring him in.
No, Wyatt was already pulling on his boots. Renata, listen, because I'm only going to say it once, and then I'm doing it whether you bless it or not. Bring him in procedurally, and you arrest him, Mirandize him, turn him into a defendant who lawyers up and gives you nothing, and his handlers know within a day he's burned, and whatever they're planning either accelerates or vanishes. You lose the network, you lose the end game. He stood, but that's not why. The reason I'm doing it my way is that I've spent 6 months watching that kid call his mother every Sunday in the cold and laugh so she won't worry, and I'd stake my life that whatever he did with a knife at someone's throat, and it was not his throat. He's not a spy, he's a hostage, and you don't break a hostage by reading him his rights. You break him with the truth, gently, from someone he trusts, somewhere he's safe. A pause. Give me 1 hour with him before you do anything. 1 hour, alone. Put a wire on me if you want. Have your people in the trees. But the door stays shut, and it's just me and him and the truth. He'll come to us, because he's been waiting for someone to make him stop. A long silence. Then,
1 hour.
said Renata Cruz.
And Mr. Cole, you said something weeks ago I didn't acknowledge. You said we were hunting an operation, not a man.
Her voice was very quiet.
Go remind that boy he's a man, not an operation. And bring him home.
He found Daniel on the loading dock in the gray dawn, of course, just off the phone with his mother, his careful face still soft with the last of her voice. And Wyatt sat down beside him on the cold concrete the way he had 100 times. and for a while neither of them said anything. The eastern sky went from charcoal to ash to the first thin gold over the kudzu hills, and the world was very quiet because the cicadas still slept in the cold ground, and Wyatt let the silence do the first part of the work. Then he said, gently, not looking at him, "How is she, Daniel?" "Your mother. Her health, really." And Daniel Feng went very still, stiller than his usual stillness. And Wyatt felt the boy understand, all at once, that it was over, and felt beside him in the cold the long, shuddering, total release of a man who has carried a weight alone so long he has forgotten any other way to stand, finally being allowed to set it down. He did not deny it. That was the first mercy. He lowered his head, and his shoulders shook, and he said in a voice scraped to nothing, "They have a photograph of her at the market, with her vegetables. They showed me." And then it all came out in the gray dawn, the dumplings and the oranges and the kindness. Auntie Shen, who had been his only home, the photograph, the impossible arithmetic of his mother's safety against his friend's trust, the Sunday calls where he had to be cheerful so she would not hear what her son had become. Wyatt listened to every word without moving, without judgment, the way you listen to a wounded man finally allowed, in safety, to scream. When it was done, Daniel said hollowly,
I gave them files, not the real recipe. I could not. I told them no one person held all of it, which is even true, but enough. I'm a traitor, Wyatt. To you, to Dr. Vance, to Hannah, to this country that let me in. There is no word for me that is not traitor.
He turned at last and looked at Wyatt with his ruined, courteous face, and held out his thin wrists together the way he must have imagined 1,000 times in the dark. "So call them now. I will tell them everything. I ask only, try to get my mother out first, because they will hurt her the moment they know I stopped. She did nothing. She only had me." Wyatt did not reach for his phone. He did not take the offered wrists. He reached out instead and put his hand on the back of Daniel Feng's bowed neck, the way a brother would, the way no instructor at any facility had ever taught him, and said, "Put your hands down, Daniel. Nobody's arresting you. I'm going to tell you something and you're going to believe it, because I've never lied to you, and I'm not starting now. You are not a traitor. You're a man they put in a vice, and you did the only thing a son could do. And the second I gave you a way out, you took it without a fight. You've been praying for it. That's not a traitor. That's a hostage. There's a difference, and it's the only one that matters, and there are good people who already understand it and want to help you." He gripped the boy's neck. "And I'm going to get your mother out. My word. Not someday. This week, before anyone in Shanghai knows the wind changed. There are people who can do it, and they will, because you're going to help us do something worth it to them. You hear me? You're not their weapon anymore. You're going to be ours. And it'll cost you, and it'll be dangerous. But at the end, you get to be what you actually are. A good man who got caught in something evil and found the way back out." He stood and held out his hand, not for the wrists, but to pull the boy up onto his feet. "Stand up. We've got about 50 minutes before the FBI walks through that gate, and I need you on your feet when they do." Daniel Feng looked up at the offered hand, and the soldier's steady, scarred face, and the gold dawn behind it, and something came back into his eyes that had been gone since October. Wyatt recognized it, because he had been chasing it himself all summer. It was hope. He took the hand and stood up. Chapter 12. The Double Game. They turned him in a borrowed conference room at the Atlanta field office over one long day, and it was Cruz's partner who did the gentlest part. Special Agent Kevin Zhao was Wyatt's age, soft-spoken, with a wrestler's build going comfortably to seed and a manner so disarming that suspects routinely forgot, far too late, that they were talking to one of the most effective counterintelligence officers in the southeastern United States. His grandparents had fled the mainland in 1949. His family's relationship with the party that now sent men to threaten frail widows in Chengdu was a complicated, generations-deep grief. He sat across from Daniel and spoke to him for a while in Mandarin, quietly, two sons of the same vast and wounded civilization, and told him a thing Wyatt only learned the translation of afterward and never forgot.
He told him,
Cruz said,
that loving your country and serving the men who happen to hold the whip are not the same thing, and never have been. And the proof is that the men with the whip had to threaten an old woman to get what they wanted, because a country you have to threaten people to serve isn't a country. It's a hostage situation with a flag. And then he told him the bravest thing a person can do for a place they love is refuse to let cruel men do cruel things in its name.
She looked at Wyatt.
Daniel cried, and then he signed.
The deal was clean and merciful, and the kind the patient, invisible people of the Counterintelligence Division had learned over hard decades was worth more than any conviction. Daniel Feng would become a double agent. He would continue, under FBI control, to feed Auntie Shen and her masters exactly what they asked for, except that what they asked for would now be written by the Bureau and by Hannah Reese. A masterpiece of poison, a cicada architecture so plausible, so detailed, so seductively almost right that the best photonics engineers in China would pour years and fortunes into building it before they discovered, far too late, the rot at its heart. The single buried error that would make every chip grown to its recipe fail in ways they could never quite diagnose. It was, Drummond said with awe when they let him in, the most beautiful trap he had ever heard of. To let your enemy steal your secret, and have the secret itself be the weapon. In exchange, the United States would do three things. It would not prosecute Daniel on condition of full and continuing cooperation. It would, when the operation closed, give him a path to stay, to remain free in the strange, dry country that had let him in. And it would, beginning that very night, move heaven and earth to get his mother out. That last was Wyatt's condition, the one he had given his word on, and it was harder than the rest together, because the FBI does not operate in Chengdu, and Fang Lian was a frail retired schoolteacher under the eye of an apparatus that missed nothing. But it could be done, quietly, if done before the wind changed. And there were people, Cruz said, whose names she would not speak, who owed the United States favors in inconvenient places, who could arrange for an elderly woman to take a long-promised trip to visit a cousin across a border, a perfectly ordinary trip any grandmother might take, from which it would simply turn out she never came back. It would take a week. It would have to happen before the trap sprang. And it would have to happen without Daniel showing, on any cheerful Sunday call, the slightest tremor of the truth.
Can you do that?
Cruz asked him.
Call her Sunday, be her happy son, and not let her hear that everything is about to change?
And Daniel Feng, who had been performing exactly that impossible cheerfulness for 6 months under threat of her death, looked at her with something that was almost, after everything, a smile, and said, Agent Cruz, I have had a great deal of practice. The take, when Daniel began giving it to the FBI instead of to Shanghai, told them everything. And what it told set the clock falling faster than even Wyatt had feared. The export controls had spooked the apparatus exactly as he'd predicted. The legal road was closing. The welding was nearly done. And so Han Ziyu, for that, Daniel confirmed, was the true name of the man with the gray eyes and the trembling hand. Han Ziyu, a former physicist of the Institute of Plasma Physics, turned the ministry's most prized acquirer of foreign science, had received authorization for what the take called, in its bloodless way, direct recovery. No more patience, no more poetry. They would steal a working prototype, a real one, not a decoy, because Beijing's engineers wanted hardware to reverse engineer in parallel with the files, and carry it out of the country in a single night before anyone knew it was gone. The plan came in over the following days in fragments, through Daniel and through Cruz's intercepts. On a night 3 weeks out, Daniel would deliver, to a handoff outside the wire, a working Cicada prototype and the master files, the golden masks, the recipe, the crown jewels. From there, the package would be driven south and east through the dark of the Georgia Lowcountry to a private airfield near the coast, where a business jet, filed for the Caribbean and onward by routes that did not bear examination, waited to carry it beyond American reach forever. Hahn himself would oversee the airfield. Daniel was certain, and Wyatt believed it, remembering the trembling hand in the third row. Hahn would not be able to stay away from the moment of possession, from the most beautiful thing he had seen in 30 years finally in his hand. Auntie Shen would run the handoff in the road, and the muscle, the protection of the package, and the removal, if it came to removal, of anyone in the way, which the take noted with chilling brevity was authorized, would be a man Daniel had met only once, and described in a single sentence that lifted the hair on Wyatt's arms.
He does not speak above a whisper.
Daniel said,
Something is wrong with his throat. Shen calls him only the quiet one. And when she introduced us, she told me, I think as a warning, so I would understand the seriousness, that he had been the best the army ever made at the work of recovering things, and that the things he recovered did not always survive the recovery, and that I should be careful to give them no reason to send him after me.
Daniel looked at Wyatt. She was smiling when she said it, the way she smiled when she gave me the oranges. Wyatt thought of the man he'd put down by the propane tank, the soft clerk's hands, the salaryman's face. A low-level courier sent to retrieve a microphone ended in 4 seconds. This was something else. This was the one the masters in the prologue had told Han to take, just in case. This was the quiet one.
3 weeks.
Wyatt said to Cruz that night, looking out at the dark hills where, any night now, the cicadas would wake.
Then it all happens in one night, in the dark, on a back road and at a country airfield, against a man who doesn't survive his recoveries. We get one chance to take down the whole network at once. One night. If we miss,
We won't miss.
said Renata Cruz. But Wyatt Cole, who had been promised before that they would not miss in other countries, in other lives, only said, Get the old woman out first, Daniel's mother. Whatever it costs, whoever you wake up. I'll run this whole thing your way, patient, by the book, all of it. But the one piece that is not negotiable, the one I gave my word on, is that the boy's mother is across a friendly border and out of their reach before a single one of us drives down that road in the dark. Everything else we can risk, not her. Promise me. A pause. Then Renata Cruz, who did not make promises lightly, said,
I promise you. She comes out first.
And 8,000 miles away, in a sunny southern city across a border she'd been told was friendly, a retired schoolteacher named Fang Lian packed a small bag for a long-promised visit to a cousin she had not seen in 20 years, and looked forward, with the simple, uncomplicated joy of a grandmother on holiday, to the sunshine, and had no idea that her son's love had just reached 8,000 miles to lift her, gently, out of the path of the falling clock. Chapter 13. The Last Honest Thing. He told Hannah the truth on a Tuesday night, all of it, because he could not take her into the last weeks on a foundation of secrets, and because Cruz had finally agreed the operation was close enough to its end, and Hannah's role in the poison so central that protecting her with ignorance was over. He told her on the loading dock, in the dark, and it took a long time, and she did not interrupt once. The gray sedan by the church, the microphone in the clean room, the man with the knife and the 4 seconds and how close he had come to the other thing, Cruz and the patient game. And then, the hardest part, Daniel. The photograph of an old woman with her vegetables, the dumplings and the oranges and the vice. He watched her honest face break and reform as she understood, all at once, what the gentle, homesick boy in the corner had carried alone all winter while she'd been giddy with the demonstration and half-charmed by a murderer's letters. And last and worst, David Hahn, who he truly was. Han Ziyu, the physicist who had turned the love of beautiful things into a tool for stealing them. The trembling hand in the third row at the instant the secret of the heat flashed onto the screen. The open science poetry written, every elegant word, by an intelligence service, to find the one truth she loved most and turn it into the lever that would pry her open. When he finished, Hannah was quiet a long time in the dark. Then she said, small, "He quoted me to myself. Light is the one honest thing that belongs to everyone. I said that to you, on this dock, the first night. And he said it back, and I thought, finally, someone powerful who gets it. And it was you. It was you all along, the person I actually said it to. He just read it somewhere, in a file." She stopped, understanding the full ugliness. Her most private, cherished idea sitting in an intelligence file, studied, weaponized, aimed. He turned the most honest thing I believe into bait, and I bit. I kept writing back. I defended him to you. I told you you needed there to be a war. She turned, eyes streaming. I'm sorry. You were carrying all of it, the knife, the boy, the war, and couldn't even tell me, and I made you carry it alone and then blamed you for the weight. You couldn't have known. That's not the point, and you know it. She wiped her face, furiously, done with crying. The point is, you asked me to trust you with the part I couldn't see, and I said I don't know, and you carried it anyway, alone, all winter, because that's who you are. Not the soldier who only knows war. The man who shoulders the thing nobody else can carry and lets them hate him for it rather than crack and put them in danger. She took his scarred face in both her hands. That's who soldered things, Wyatt. He was never a cover. You told me he was the realest thing you ever got to be, and you were right. And I'm the one who forgot it. She pressed her forehead to his. I'm not going anywhere. Whatever the next weeks are, I'm in it, not on the sidelines. I'm going to build them the most beautiful poison anyone ever made, because nobody alive knows this architecture well enough to make the lie that perfect except me. And then I'm going to be standing next to you when it ends. That's not a request. And Wyatt Cole, who had come to Georgia to lay the weapon down and live a small, quiet, honest life, held the woman he loved in the dark while the first cicada of the new year woke somewhere in the warming ground and tried its voice. One long, uncertain note, then silence, then, gathering, the beginning of the great chorus, and understood that he was not, after all, going to get the small, quiet life. The world had reached into Georgia and put the weapon back in his hand and would not take it out again. And the only thing he got to choose, the only thing any man ever got to choose, was what he picked it up for. His first war, he had picked it up because he was told to. This time he would pick it up for her, for Daniel, for Nell, for the old woman with the vegetables, safe now across a friendly border, for the cool, serene light in the steel shed. He would pick it up not to become the thing again, but to end it. And there was, he discovered, holding Hannah in the singing dark, a whole world of difference between those two. A difference as wide as the one between a hostage and a man. and it was the difference that was going to let him keep his soul. They came for Hannah 8 days later, and that was how Wyatt knew the patient game was over and the falling part had begun. It was near midnight. She'd stayed late building her poison, and he'd walked her to her car as he always did now. And they'd just reached it when the old animal at the base of his skull screamed, and there was a van where no van should be, and 2 men moving fast and silent out of the dark with a hood and a roll of tape. And the whole thing had the cold, professional shape of an abduction. Remove a loved one, apply leverage, accelerate the timeline. Wyatt did not think, because thinking is slow. He shoved Hannah down and back behind the engine block where steel would stop a blade, and met the first man before he'd closed the distance. It was over in seconds, and again he could not afterward reconstruct it. He used the car. He used the dark. He used the 18 years he had tried so hard to give back. The first man went down hard against the door frame and stayed down. The second was better, much better, and there was a bad moment when steel went past Wyatt's face close enough to feel, and his old ribs took another shallow line. But Cruz had a surveillance team in the trees that night, as she had every night for a week, and headlights bloomed and a voice shouted, "FBI!" on the ground. And the second man, a professional who knew the difference between a recovery and a suicide, broke and ran into the dark, and the van roared away. And then it was just Wyatt on the gravel, breathing hard, bleeding again, with Hannah pulling herself up white-faced from behind the engine block. The man who'd gone down against the door frame never got up, and would never tell them anything. Another low courier, clerk's hands, not the quiet one. The quiet one, they understood, was being saved for the airfield, for the night the package moved, for the work that things did not always survive.
They moved on Hannah because the review got bumped up.
Cruz said an hour later in the shed, while a paramedic taped Wyatt's ribs and Hannah held his hand hard enough to hurt, and Nell, white with fury, stood guard at the door like a small, terrible sentinel.
Word came down today. Interagency review accelerated. The welding's almost done. So they couldn't wait 3 weeks. They tried to grab leverage to speed it up. They failed. So they're moving the whole operation forward instead. Daniel's last take confirms it. Shen contacted him an hour ago, frantic, changing the schedule.
Her flat eyes were very still. "It's not 3 weeks, Mr. Cole. The package moves the night after tomorrow." Wyatt looked at Hannah's hand in his and the cool, serene glow of the chip under its dome across the shed, and the dark hills where the cicadas had finally fully woken and were singing now in their thousands, the way they'd sung the night this began. "Daniel's mother, is she out?" Cruz almost smiled.
She landed in a sunny city across a friendly border this morning. She's visiting a cousin. She is having,
said Renata Cruz,
a lovely time, and she is never going home, and she has no idea yet how brave her son turned out to be.
She put a hand briefly on his shoulder.
You kept your word. She's out. Now let's go end this.
Chapter 14. Run to the Dark. The night the package moved was warm and starless, the river smell heavy in the air and the cicadas screaming in the black trees. And it began, as planned, with Daniel Feng driving alone out of the wire of cicada systems at 11:15, a working prototype and a set of master files on the seat beside him. The prototype was real. That had been the hardest call, fought over for an hour. The ministry's engineers wanted hardware, and a decoy chip would be spotted within days, and the whole point was to let them carry away something they believed in. So the chip on the seat was a genuine cicada prototype, but of the poison, grown by Hannah herself to the beautiful, ruinous, almost right recipe. A chip that would work just well enough in a quick test to pass inspection, and then lead a nation's finest minds for years down a road that ended at a cliff. They were giving the enemy exactly what the enemy had come for, That was the trap. That had always been the trap. The taking down of the network, the handler, the muscle, Auntie Shen, and above all Han Ziyu himself, was the night's true work. And that would happen at the airfield, where the FBI's tactical teams and a great many federal agents were, even now, settling into the dark around a private airstrip near the coast, waiting for the prize and its keepers to come to them. Daniel was wired and tracked, and not alone, though he felt alone, driving the dark county road with his heart slamming. 2 cars back, lights off, running on night optics, Wyatt rode with Cruz in a blacked-out federal vehicle, and behind them, more. A long, invisible chain of the United States government strung out through the Georgia dark. The plan was simple and good. Let Daniel make the handoff to Shen, let her people drive the package south to the airfield, follow, and take the whole thing down at once on the tarmac, with Han's trembling hand actually closing on the box, so no diplomatic cleverness could ever pretend he hadn't been there. The plan held for 40 minutes. The handoff went clean. A dark crossroads, a gray van, Auntie Shen herself stepping out under the one streetlight, small and white-haired and grandmotherly, taking the case from Daniel's hands with a smile and a soft word in the dialect of home, patting his cheek, "Good boy, good boy." While a quarter-mile back, Wyatt watched through the optics and felt his jaw ache with the effort of not moving. The van turned south. The chain of cars followed through the dark, patient and invisible, toward the waiting net. And then, 11 minutes from the airfield, on a long, empty stretch of 2-lane blacktop with black water in the ditches and the cicadas screaming, the van did a thing it was not supposed to do. It stopped, in the middle of the road. For no reason.
That's not the plan,
Cruz said softly, and Wyatt was already feeling the cold drop in his stomach, the one he trusted, because he understood before the radio crackled what a professional does when she has run a quiet road for 11 minutes and seen no one and grown, in her old careful bones, suspicious of seeing no one. She stops, in the open, where she can watch the road behind her, and makes the road show her whether it is empty. Auntie Shen had run 1,000 roads. Auntie Shen had felt the net. The radio crackled. All units hold, and then the van's side door opened, and in the green wash of the optics, the quiet one stepped out into the road, unhurried, enormous, a long weapon in his hands, and turned to face the dark behind the van, the dark where the United States was hiding. And Wyatt saw Auntie Shen at the van's window with a phone to her ear, and understood she was making a call, and understood to whom, and understood that in about 4 seconds the airfield net was going to find itself waiting for a jet that would never take off, and a package that would never arrive. Because Han Ziyu, 11 minutes away on a dark tarmac, was about to be told to run. There was no more time for the patient game. They've made us. Shen's calling the airfield. Han's going to run. We move now or we lose him forever. Wyatt was already out of his harness. Renata, call your team at the field. Tell them go now. Take the airfield this second. Don't wait for the package, before Han gets in that jet. And this road, he looked at the van stopped in the black road, the quiet one turning with his weapon, small, terrible Auntie Shen with the poisoned prize on the seat beside her. This road is ours, right now. Cruz keyed her radio, and the night came apart. It is a strange thing about a fight in the dark, that it is mostly silence and waiting, punctuated by instants too fast and too loud to hold. And Wyatt moved through it the way he had moved through others, low and fast along the black ditch with the water soaking him cold, and the cicadas screaming on as though nothing were happening. while behind and around him, federal vehicles bloomed light, and the quiet one's long weapon hammered at them and was answered. His whole concern was the van, the prize, and Shen and her phone. Because if Shen finished her call, Han was gone. And Han was the whole point. Han was the man whose trembling hand had said, "I will have this whatever it costs." And Wyatt was not going to let the cost go uncollected. He came up out of the ditch on the van's blind side while the quiet one was occupied with the killing at the rear, and he reached the window before Auntie Shen knew he was there, and he took the phone out of her hand, gently almost, plucking it from her old fingers mid-sentence, and looked into the face of the kindly grandmother who had spent a winter feeding a homesick boy oranges and breaking his heart, and he saw it change. He would remember that afterward, the way the warmth fell off her face like a mask off a hook, all at once, with no transition, revealing underneath not anger, not fear, but a flat professional appraisal as cold and quick as Cruz's own. The face of a woman who had been doing this since before Wyatt was born, who had survived 100 nights like this one, and who was already, in the half-second their eyes met, deciding precisely how to kill him. There was a small pistol coming up in her other hand, fast, faster than a woman of 68 had any right to be. And Wyatt did the thing he had been broken and rebuilt to do, the thing every nerve in a normal man screams against, and he moved into it instead of away, and trapped the gun hand against the window frame, and the shot went into the dark and the river, and then it was very close and very brief, and entirely without mercy on her side, and entirely with it on his. And at the end of it, Auntie Shen was face down on the road with her wrists behind her, and Wyatt's knee in her back, and her cheek against the warm blacktop, and she was laughing, a soft, dry, genuinely amused laugh. And she said, in perfect, unaccented English, the only words she would ever say to him, "You are better than your file. They will be so embarrassed." And then, still laughing softly, "It does not matter. You are 11 minutes too late, soldier. He is already gone." Behind the van, the quiet one had stopped firing. Wyatt looked up. In the wreckage of light and dark, agents were moving forward over a still shape on the road. The quiet one had not survived his last recovery. He had stood in the open against a force he could not beat and made them put him down, which was, Wyatt understood, the only kind of surrender a man like that knew how to offer. And 11 minutes south, in Wyatt's earpiece, Cruz's tactical commander was reporting in a clipped, flat voice that the airfield was secured, the aircraft seized, the ground crew in custody, and that the principal was not present. Han Ziyu was not on the tarmac. Han Ziyu was not in the jet. Han Ziyu, warned by a phone call from a kindly grandmother lying face down on a dark Georgia road, had, in the 4 minutes between Shen's call connecting and the tactical team's breach, simply walked off the edge of the operation and disappeared, the way smoke disappears, the way the most careful man either of them had ever met had spent a lifetime learning to disappear. Auntie Shen, her cheek against the warm road, laughed her soft, dry laugh into the dark. "Too late," she said again, almost kindly. "You caught the hand, soldier. You did not catch the mind. You never catch the mind." Chapter 15. The Incident. It went loud, after all, which is what they had spent 6 patient months trying to prevent, and there was no preventing it once gunfire echoed across a dark Georgia road and a man lay dead on the blacktop, because gunfire on American soil cannot be made quiet, and a dead foreign intelligence operative cannot be made to vanish. And within 72 hours, the thing that Cicada Systems had been, a secret in a shed on a hill, had become a headline on every screen on Earth. The Bureau and the Justice Department moved first, and they moved hard, because for once they had what they almost never have, A clean, overwhelming, undeniable case. They had the listening device. They had Shen, alive and in custody and, after the road, beyond any plausible cover. They had a captured business jet on a private strip with a flight plan that traced to nowhere good. They had a working, poisoned prototype recovered from a gray van and a chain of intercepts, and a cooperating witness whose testimony, given quietly and under protection, laid the whole architecture of the operation bare from Shanghai to Chattahoochee Hills. And they had, when the indictments were unsealed, named the man at the center of it, Han Ziyu, also known as David Han, an officer of the Ministry of State Security of the People's Republic of China, charged with economic espionage, conspiracy, and a string of lesser counts that ran to 40 pages, and a federal warrant for his arrest, which was, everyone understood, a piece of paper that would never be served, because Han Ziyu was already gone, was already, in all likelihood, back behind the welded door of the windowless building 8,000 miles to the east, hearing the bad news in a cold, gray room. The People's Republic responded as the People's Republic always responds, which is to say with a flat and total denial delivered at a tone of wounded fury. A spokeswoman for the Foreign Ministry, standing at a lectern in Beijing, called the charges a malicious fabrication, a hysterical slander, the latest poisonous fruit of the American Cold War mentality, and accused the United States of manufacturing a so-called spy case to suppress China's legitimate scientific development and slander Chinese scholars studying peacefully abroad. She demanded the immediate release of the Chinese citizen unlawfully detained, meaning Shen, whom Beijing now insisted was nothing but an elderly visiting professor of classical poetry, the victim of a brutal entrapment. There was, of course, no mention of Han Ziyu, who, according to the Foreign Ministry, did not exist, had never existed, was a phantom invented by American propaganda. And then, 4 days after the indictments, in the way these things have always been done, the other shoe fell on the far side of the world. An American, a businessman named Halloran, 51, an executive for an Atlanta-based logistics company that had nothing whatever to do with Cicada systems, who had been in Shanghai for a perfectly ordinary trade conference, was detained at his hotel by men who did not fully identify themselves, and was charged, 2 days later, under a vague and capacious statute, with activities endangering national security. No evidence was produced. No evidence was needed. The arithmetic was as old as the trade and required no explanation to anyone who understood it. You have one of ours. We now have one of yours. We will discuss an exchange when you are ready to be reasonable, and in the meantime, the American businessman in the cell in Shanghai is a hostage to the freedom of the elderly poet in the cell in Atlanta, and the whole watching world may draw whatever conclusion it likes. It was hostage diplomacy, naked and unembarrassed, and it landed on the front page of every newspaper on the planet, and overnight a chip in a shed in Chattahoochee Hills became a flashpoint between the two most powerful nations on Earth. The State Department summoned the Chinese ambassador. The Chinese ministry summoned the American ambassador. There were grave statements and canceled meetings, and a tariff threatened and a tariff answered. And for about 2 weeks, the thing teetered on the edge of becoming something genuinely dangerous, the way these things do. The small, hard incident threatening to strike a spark into the great dry tinder of a rivalry that ran far deeper and wider than one chip or one shed. Drummond, watching it unfold on the television in the shed with the grim recognition of a man who had been near the edge of such things before, said only, "Well, we wanted to keep it quiet, son. We did everything right and we still ended up on the news. That's the lesson, if there is one. You can do everything right and still end up on the news, because the thing you made was always going to be too big to stay in Georgia." He turned off the television. The question now is just what we do about it. And I'm afraid I already know the answer, and so do you, and neither of us is going to like it. Hansi Yu was never caught. That was the part Wyatt would carry, the splinter that would not work its way out. They had taken the hand, the network rolled up, the assets in custody, the operation a smoking ruin, the stolen prize a poisoned trap that would cost the apparatus years and fortunes and embarrassment they could never admit to. But they had not taken the mind, and the mind was, even now, somewhere behind the welded door, alive, brilliant, patient, and humiliated. And a humiliated, patient, brilliant mind, Wyatt knew, is the most dangerous thing in the world, because it does not learn the lesson you wish it would learn. It learns a different one. It learns to be more careful next time. Chapter 16. Red Clay. In the end, they took the deal, because there was never really any other deal to take, and because the alternative to being protected by the United States was, as Drummond had said, a thing best understood by studying the man in the cell in Shanghai. It was not the company they had dreamed of on that bright Tuesday in the lawyer's strip mall office in Noonan. The open dream, Hannah's dream, the light given freely to all the world, the most honest thing belonging to everyone. That dream was over, and they all knew it, and there was a grief in that which never entirely went away. Cicada Systems became, by a thicket of agreements that Mr. Pruitt and a great many government lawyers spent a hard summer negotiating, something stranger and narrower and safer. A partnership, deep and binding, with the government of the United States. The foundry would be built on American soil, behind clearances and fences and the full weight of federal counterintelligence. The architecture would be classified, walled, controlled, sold and licensed only where Washington permitted, which was not many places, and never, ever to the long list of nations that included the one whose ministry had sent Hansi Yu up the road. Nell hated it to the last, and signed it anyway, and was right to. But Drummond's old clauses held. That was the thing. The clauses he had drafted on the first day, the ones they hadn't understood for 2 years, they held, and they kept the founders in control of what could still be controlled. And they meant that when the dust settled and the money came, real money now, mountains of it, the governments and a great deal else besides, it was Nell Vance and Hannah Reese and Daniel Feng and Wyatt Cole who owned the heart of the thing, and not a board, and not a fund, and not a charming man with gray eyes and a fund called Lotus Pacific. Nell, who had had her life's work stolen once before by a charming man with good shoes, would not have it stolen again. And this time it was not. She was, the business press now wrote, one of the most important engineers alive. She gave exactly one interview, was magnificently rude in it, and never gave another. Wyatt thought it was the happiest he had ever seen her. Daniel Feng was not prosecuted. The deal held, all of it. The cooperation given fully, the testimony given quietly, the redemption earned in the dark on a Georgia road where, at the end, when it counted, when he could have run and saved himself, he had done the bravest thing of all and stayed wired and stayed visible and driven into the trap to spring it, knowing the quiet one might be waiting. He stayed. He was given the path that had been promised, the path to remain free in the strange, dry country that had let him in and that he had, through everything, against everything, come to love. And in the autumn, on a clear, cool day with the persimmons ripening somewhere far away in a courtyard he would never see again, Daniel Feng stood in the arrivals hall of the Atlanta airport, the busiest airport on the planet, where 250,000 strangers a day touch the earth, and watched a small, frail, white-haired woman come through the doors with a string bag she had refused, all the way across the world, to be parted from. And he did not move, and he did not breathe. And then his mother saw him, and Daniel Fang, who had been a good man trapped in something evil and had found his way back out, went to pieces in the most beautiful way a man can, in the arms of the mother he had saved. Wyatt watched from a distance, with Hannah's hand in his, and did not trust himself to speak. He stayed too. That was the thing Wyatt had to decide in the long, quiet weeks after the incident faded from the news. After the elderly poet and the Atlanta businessman were, in the fullness of time and the back channels of diplomacy, quietly exchanged on a tarmac in a neutral country, each flown home to a different idea of justice, after the foundry broke ground. After the cicadas, their season finished, fell silent again in the cooling earth. He had come to Georgia to lay the weapon down, and the world had put it back in his hand. And now the question was whether he could ever again be the man who soldered things and read Nell's papers and got yelled at about cap tables, or whether that man had only ever been a holiday from the truth. It was Hannah who gave him the answer, though she did not know she was giving it. On the loading dock one evening at the end of summer, with the long gold light over the kudzu hills.
You keep talking like you have to choose,
She said,
the soldier or the other guy. Like one of them's real and one's a costume, and you have to pick.
She leaned against him.
But I watched you on that road, Wyatt. Cruz told me what you did, all of it. How you took the gun off a woman who was trying to kill you, and you didn't kill her, when every instinct you've got was screaming to. And the law would have cleared you in a heartbeat, and instead you put your knee in her back and her wrists in cuffs and let her live to laugh at you. That's not the soldier you came here running from. The soldier you came here running from would have killed her.
She looked up at him. You're not two men, and you don't have to pick. You're one man who used to pick up the weapon because he was told to, and learned the hard way how to put it down, and then learned, on that road, for me, for Daniel, for that old woman with the vegetables, how to pick it back up and stay yourself. That's not a curse, Wyatt. That's the rarest thing there is. Most people who can do what you can do lose their souls doing it. You went and got yours back. The least you could do is stop apologizing for the only thing that ever lets you keep it. And Wyatt Cole stood on the loading dock in the gold light with the woman he loved, and understood that she was right. That the hero arc he had been quietly grieving all year, the one where he got to be normal, the one where the war stayed buried, was the wrong story. That the real one, the one he was actually living, was harder and stranger and far better. Not a man escaping what he was, but a man who had finally learned what it was for. To stand between the people he loved and the dark that came up the road. To pick up the terrible thing and use it, and lay it back down, and remain, at the end of it, someone Hannah Reese would still want to stand next to on a loading dock in the gold light. That was the whole of it. That was the only heroism there ever was. He kissed her. Above them, the chapel clock, wrong by 60-some years, struck a confident and erroneous hour. Down the hill, the lights of the little college came on one by one, and beyond them, the foundry's first steel rose against the dusk. And in the steel shed behind them, the small, cool chip glowed the color of moonlight, patient and serene, doing the arithmetic of the future on the power of a reading lamp.
Stay.
Hannah said into his shoulder. It was not a question.
I'm staying,
said Wyatt Cole. And the warm Georgia dark came down over the hills, and somewhere deep in the cooling earth, already, the next year's cicadas were beginning, patient, unseen, building in the dark toward a sudden and deafening emergence into the light. Epilogue. Elsewhere, a man listens. The room had no windows. It was on the 11th floor of a building that pretended, on its brass plate, to be an institute for the cooperation of advanced materials, and it pretended a great many things. And the carpet was the gray of a dead television, and a man sat alone in front of a single glowing screen, very still, the way a heron is still over water. Hansi Yu was reading. He was reading the American business press, the long, admiring, infuriating profiles of Cicada systems, of the brilliant, rude professor and the luminous girl who had made light think, of the new American foundry rising behind its fences, of the technology that would, the analysts now agreed, define the next 40 years, and that was now, thanks to a welded door and a federal warrant with his own name on it, entirely and permanently beyond his reach. He had been recalled. He had been debriefed at length in rooms colder than this one by men who had not raised their voices, which was worse. He had lost the hand, the network, the assets, the elderly poet who would spend her last years in an American prison, or, if the diplomats earned their salaries, a Chinese one, which she would not thank them for. And he had carried home, in the end, a prize, a working prototype, smuggled out by other means after the airfield burned, a genuine Cicada chip now sitting in a laboratory in Guiyang, where the finest minds in the People's Republic had been studying it, around the clock, for 3 months. It was the chip that he was thinking about now, in the windowless room, with his right hand trembling on the desk and his steady left hand laid over it. Because the chip did not work. Oh, it worked at first. It worked beautifully, exactly as the demonstration had promised, fast and cool and impossible. And there had been 3 days of triumph in Guiyang, 3 days in which Hansi Yu had begun, cautiously, to believe he might survive his failure after all. And then the chips they grew to its recipe had begun to fail. Not all at once, not obviously. They failed slowly, subtly, intermittently, in ways the engineers could not diagnose and could not reproduce and could not, after 3 months and a fortune, explain. As though there were something wrong in the very recipe itself, some single buried error too deep and too clever to find, a rot at the heart of the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Hansi Yu sat very still in the windowless room and looked at the photograph of the cool, serene chip on his screen and understood, slowly, the way a man understands the diagnosis he has feared, that he had not stolen the secret. He had been given it. That the luminous girl, or the rude professor, or the soldier who was better than his file, or all of them together, had reached out across the ocean and handed him exactly what he had spent a year trying to take, and that the gift itself had been the weapon, and that even now, 8,000 miles away in a steel shed in a state he had finally found on a map, they were laughing. He did not rage. He was far past rage. Rage was for amateurs. He sat in the cold gray light and he felt, instead, the old thing, the patient thing, the thing that had carried him through 11 years and 100 operations, a slow, clean, almost peaceful tightening of resolve. They had beaten him. He acknowledged it, the way he acknowledged any fact, without sentiment. They had taken the hand, but they had not taken the mind. They never took the mind. And the mind, Hansi Yu reflected, covering his trembling right hand with his steady left, had a very long memory and a very great deal of time, and the patience, the famous, bottomless, civilizational patience, to wait for the next bright girl in the next small town to say a number out loud in a coffee shop, somewhere in the wide and careless and brilliant and undefended country across the sea, where the people who change the weather over half the world still, even now, even after everything, could not quite stop themselves from standing on the wall and shouting the secret across the water. He would be listening when they did. Hansi Yu turned off the screen, and the windowless room went dark. And in the dark, very softly, almost without being aware he was doing it, he began to hum. An old song, a marching song, the words long since worn off it like the date from an old coin. And his grandfather's melody filled the cold and lightless room, patient and unhurried, like something building underground, in the dark, toward a sound the world had not yet learned to fear. 8,000 miles to the west it was evening in Georgia, and the cicadas had come. They had come early again that year, 3 weeks ahead of any calendar, and they filled the warm dusk over the kudzu hills with their high electric sawing, rising and falling like surf. And on the loading dock of a steel shed on a ridge above the Chattahoochee, a man and a woman sat with their feet hanging over the warm concrete and a bottle of good bourbon between them, and did not talk, because they did not need to, and watched the lights come on in the little college below, and the new foundry's steel catch the last of the light, and were, for that hour, in that place, against everything the wide world could do, entirely and quietly happy. The future was glowing the color of moonlight in the shed behind them, patient and serene and cool to the touch, and it was, for now, in good hands. The end.